The leader of the envoys opened his mouth, and a melodic, calm voice flowed out, easily filling the entire hall without ever rising above a conversational tone. Greetings, King Ruger. The Empire sends its greetings. The king suppressed the anger in his voice. He had to have had enough of people disrespecting his authority in his own throne room in a single day, but he showed no sign of it. His expression remained placid, almost bored. Impressive control. Northern noted the slight tension in the man's shoulders, the way his fingers pressed just a fraction too hard against the armrest. Most men would have snapped by now. And to what do we owe this grand visit? The king's pause before grand was deliberate, pointed. Hasn't it been, what? 113 years since envoys last touched this land. The leader spoke again, his voice still carrying that calm, sweet quality that made Northern's instincts prickle. Indeed, indeed, he sighed, almost wistfully. Ah, so long. He smiled. The expression was coy, carefully crafted, and deeply unsettling to those who knew how to read beyond it. Roma stood beside her father, frowning. Prince Rieran was on the king's right, stern-faced and rigid with barely contained hostility. Yet all of them together didn't even match the presence of the man speaking. He commanded the room simply by existing in it, his soft voice somehow more oppressive than any shouting could be. The Emperor, the current of the Crimson Tide, has decided to bestow his grace upon you, pushing for a diplomatic relationship. The leader's smile widened, as if he were about to deliver the most wonderful news in the world. The Emperor, in his infinite wisdom and benevolence, has outlined terms most favorable for your nation's continued prosperity. He produced a scroll from within his coat with a flourish that seemed almost theatrical, the practiced motion of a man who had delivered death sentences while smiling. First, an annual tribute of 70% of all Ethereum mined within your borders. This is, of course, a reasonable request given the Empire's protection and goodwill. The throne room went deathly quiet. Northern could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden vacuum of sound. His eyes narrowed. 70% of their primary resource? That's not a tribute, that's economic strangulation. They'd be vassals within a decade, dependent on imperial scraps to survive. But the king said nothing. His jaw tightened, the only crack in his composure, but he remained seated, controlled. The envoy leader continued, his melodic voice never wavering from its pleasant tone. Second, Ryugen will provide 5,000 able-bodied men annually for service in the imperial forces. Think of it as an exchange program. His smile never flickered. Your warriors will have the honor of serving the Empire directly. He paused, as if waiting for gratitude that would never come. Third, all trade routes to and from Ryugen will be subject to imperial oversight. A modest tariff of 40% on all goods, naturally. For administrative purposes, you understand. Northern could feel the rage building in the room like pressure in a sealed container. The officials around him were trembling. Not with fear, but with barely suppressed fury. One man's hand had drifted toward his sword hilt without seeming to realize it. He's not here to negotiate. He knows exactly what he's doing. Fourth, the leader said, his smile taking on a sharper edge, Ryugen will surrender sovereignty over its airspace. All vessels entering or leaving will require imperial authorization. For security, of course. King Ruger's knuckles had gone white where they gripped the throne's armrests. But still, when he spoke, his voice remained measured. These terms are... And finally, the envoy leader interrupted smoothly, as if the king hadn't spoken at all. Ryugen will host a permanent imperial garrison of no fewer than 10,000 soldiers, to ensure stability and protect your interests. The silence that followed was suffocating. Northern watched the envoy's eyes, the way they moved across the room, cataloging every reaction, every twitch of suppressed anger. He's reading them, measuring their responses, looking for the weakest point to press. Northern understood immediately what this was. These weren't terms, they were designed to be rejected. The Empire wanted Ryugen to refuse. wanted them to react with violence, with outrage, with anything that could be spun as aggression. It would give them justification for whatever came next. King Ruger took a slow, deliberate breath. "These terms," he said carefully, "are worth consideration. We will need time to consider." The envoy leader's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Your Majesty, surely you understand the Empire's generosity here. Most nations would be honored to receive such attention from the eternal sovereign himself." The condescension in his tone was so subtle, so perfectly calibrated, that it could almost be missed. Almost. But everyone in the room heard it. The dismissal, the contempt, the unspoken threat beneath the honeyed words. "He's pushing, testing where the breaking point is, and he's patient enough to find it." "The Emperor's grace is noted," King Ruger said, his voice tight but controlled. "However, Ryujin has maintained its independence for independence." The word rolled off the envoy leader's tongue like honey laced with poison. "Such a quaint notion. Tell me, Your Majesty, how did that independence serve you during your recent difficulties? The siege you so valiantly survived." The threat was barely veiled now. A blade wrapped in silk, but still sharp enough to cut. "We endured," the king said flatly. "You endured." The envoy leader's smile was radiant. "How fortunate. Though one wonders how you might fare against a more coordinated assault. The Empire, of course, would never wish such hardship upon its friends." He spread his hands in a gesture of benevolence. "Which is precisely why these terms are so generous. They ensure your protection." Prince Rieran took a step forward, his voice sharp with anger. "Protection? You call stripping our sovereignty protection?" The envoy leader's attention shifted to Rieran like a predator spotting movement in tall grass. Ah, the young prince. How passionate. His tone dripped with patronizing amusement. "Youth often mistakes prudence for cowardice. But your father understands the realities of power, don't you, Your Majesty?" King Ruger's hand moved to Rieran's shoulder, a gentle grip, but firm. A wordless warning. But the envoy leader wasn't finished. "Of course, if these terms seem burdensome, we could discuss alternatives." His smile turned almost playful, and something cold settled in Northern's stomach. "Perhaps Princess Roma would be interested in a diplomatic marriage? The Emperor's sixth son is still unwed. Such a union would solve so many problems." Roma's face went pale, then red. Northern saw it happen, saw Rieran's composure shatter in real time. The prince's hand moved toward his blade. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. Don't give him what he wants." Rieran moved before anyone could stop him. "You dare! Prince Rieran!" The king's voice cracked like a whip across the hall. But it was too late. The envoy leader's expression transformed in an instant, the pleasant mask shattering to reveal something cold and furious beneath. "How dare you raise your voice in the presence of an imperial envoy?" His melodic tone was gone, replaced by genuine rage that filled the throne room like a physical force. "Is this the respect Ryujin shows the Empire? Is this how you respond to the Emperor's grace?" The soldiers behind him moved as one, hands snapping to weapons, blades singing as they were drawn halfway from sheaths. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the hall, a promise of violence barely restrained. The envoy leader pointed at Rieran, his hand trembling with theatrical fury. "The Empire extends its hand in friendship, and this is how you answer. With disrespect? With insult?" He turned to King Ruger, his voice dropping into something dangerous. "Your Majesty, if you cannot control your own son, how can the Empire trust you to control your nation? Perhaps a garrison is exactly what Ryujin needs, to teach you proper respect." The throne room erupted. Ryugin's guards surged forward, hands flying to their own weapons. The Imperial soldiers completed their draws, steel gleaming in the torchlight. The space between the two forces crackled with the potential for immediate bloodshed, a single wrong movement away from becoming a massacre. And through it all, Northern watched. He saw the calculation behind the envoy leader's rage, the way it had been deployed at exactly the right moment, triggered by exactly the reaction he'd been baiting for. Saw how the man's eyes remained cold even as his voice shook with fury. Saw how this entire scene had been orchestrated from the beginning. Masterful. He got exactly what he wanted, a provocation he can report back to the Empire. Justification for whatever they're planning next. And Rieren walked right into it. The envoy leader was breathing hard now, his face flushed with apparent anger. But his eyes were satisfied. The eyes of a man watching his trap spring shut. "We came here in peace," he shouted, "bearing the Emperor's goodwill. And you respond with hostility." He looked around the throne room, at the drawn weapons on both sides. "Let it be known, let it be recorded, that Ryugen has rejected the Empire's friendship. That they have chosen defiance over wisdom." King Ruger rose from his throne slowly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Stand down," he commanded his guards. Then, to the envoy, "You came here to provoke this exact response. Do not pretend otherwise." The envoy leader's smile returned, smaller now, sharper. The smile of a predator who'd already won. "Provoke? Your Majesty, I merely presented terms. Your son's outburst, your guard's aggression. These are Ryugen's choices, not ours." He gestured to his soldiers, who sheathed their weapons with synchronized precision. "We are civilized people. We do not draw steel over mere disagreements." The implication hung in the air. Ryugen had been the first to become hostile. Never mind that it was a response to calculated insults. Never mind that the entire exchange had been engineered to produce exactly this outcome. He's creating a narrative. One that will justify whatever the Empire does next. And now there's a throne room full of witnesses who saw Ryugen draw first. The envoy leader straightened his coat, composure returning as if the rage had never existed. Slipping back into pleasantness like a man donning a familiar garment. "I believe we are finished here." His pleasant tone was back, though edged with something harder now. "The Emperor will be disappointed to hear of this reception. I'm sure he'll want to discuss Ryugen's future more thoroughly." He bowed, mockingly deep, mockingly respectful. "We will return to our ships now, unless you intend to hold Imperial envoys hostage." He raised an eyebrow. "That would be an act of war, of course." King Ruger's voice was stone. "You are free to leave." "How gracious!" The envoy leader turned, his soldiers falling into formation around him with practiced ease. But before he took more than a few steps, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Oh, and your Majesty? The Empire has a long memory. We remember our friends." His smile was razor-thin. "And we remember those who refuse our friendship even more clearly." They marched out, boots echoing in perfect synchronization, the crimson banners flowing behind them like rivers of blood. The moment the doors closed, the throne room exploded into argument. Officials shouted over each other, voices overlapping into chaos. Guards demanded to know why they'd been ordered to stand down. Prince Rieren apologized profusely to his father while Roma tried to calm the situation, her voice nearly lost in the din. Northern stood apart from it all, mind working through the implications. This wasn't about tribute or treaties. This was reconnaissance. They came here to measure Ryugen's response, to create justification, and to deliver a message. Submit or be destroyed. And they'd succeeded perfectly. What he wondered now was how exactly this fit into the larger picture, the subjugation of the entire continent that Elitis had warned him about. This was one piece of a much bigger board, and Northern was only just beginning to see the shape of it. The king slumped back into his throne, suddenly looking older, tired, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him visibly. "They're going to invade," he said quietly, though his voice carried through the chaos. "Not today, maybe not this month, but they will come." Northern stepped forward, drawing attention. Everyone turned to look at him, this outsider who'd witnessed their humiliation. The room fell silent, arguments dying mid-sentence as they registered his movement. "Your Majesty," Northern said carefully, "I think you're right, and I think they're coming sooner than you expect." The king met his eyes. "Why do you say that?" Northern glanced toward the doors where the envoys had departed. Because they didn't come here to negotiate. They came here to confirm you're weak enough to attack. He paused. And thanks to Prince Rieren's outburst, no offense, they got exactly the confirmation they needed. Rieren flinched, shame written across his face. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, then closed it again. What was there to say? Then what do we do? The king asked. We can't fight the Empire. Even with our defenses, even with our warriors, they have numbers we can't match. Northern was silent for a moment, thinking, this isn't my problem. I should leave, get my people and go. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. Because the Empire wasn't just threatening Ryugen, they were positioning themselves for continental expansion. And that meant everywhere was threatened, including the people Northern actually cared about. And more importantly, more selfishly, he was curious. What kind of emperor builds a machine like this? What's he actually after? Power? Territory? Something else entirely? The questions pulled at him the way they always did. The need to understand. To see the full shape of the threat before deciding how to break it. I might have an idea, he said slowly. But you're not going to like it. The king leaned forward. At this point, Lord Northern, I'm willing to hear anything. Northern looked at Roma, then at the king, then at the assembled officials who were watching him with desperate hope. Men and women who'd just been shown exactly how outmatched they were, now looking to a stranger for salvation. I'm going to regret this, but he spoke anyway. Tell me everything you know about the Empire's military structure, their supply lines, their typical invasion strategies. He paused, letting the weight of the next words settle. And most importantly, tell me about their emperor. Because if the Empire was coming, Northern wanted to know exactly what he'd be fighting. Again, the march back through Ryugen's carved corridors felt different than the entrance. The leader of the envoys maintained his perfect posture, his expression serene, but internally he was cataloging every detail. Every nervous glance from passing guards. Every hastily closed door. Every whispered conversation that cut off as they approached. Fear. Good. That's the expected response. Behind him, his personal guard, the man in silver armor with the blue shoulder cape, spoke quietly. That went well, Lord Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus allowed himself a small smile. Better than expected, Adelais. The prince's outburst was a gift. I was prepared to push much harder. The king showed remarkable restraint, Adelais observed, his tone respectful. Restraint born of weakness, Pyrrhus corrected. The words came easily, accompanied by a familiar satisfaction. He'd seen it before. Rulers who couldn't afford to act, trapped by circumstances beyond their control. He knows he cannot fight us. The outburst simply confirmed what we already suspected. Ryugen's leadership is fragile. The old king holds on, but his children are volatile. Exploitable. The third figure, the one in casual black rags who moved with unsettling fluidity, chuckled softly. His voice carried an accent that suggested origins far from the Empire's heartland. The girl, though, the princess, she's sharper than the others. Roma. Pyrrhus nodded. Yes, she maintained composure throughout. Interesting. He made a mental note for his report. The Emperor's intelligence on the royal family would need updating. She'd grown since the last assessment, sharper, more controlled than the previous reports indicated. Worth watching. They descended grand staircases, passed through archways carved with ancient patterns, and finally emerged into the open air. The wind hit them immediately, cold, sharp, carrying the scent of stone and altitude. Ryugen's port district spread before them in descending tiers carved into the mountainside itself. Their ships waited at the docks. 3 imperial frigates, smaller than capital vessels but still formidable. Sleek hulls painted in crimson and gold, essence cannons visible along their flanks, the Emperor's banner flying from each mast. Standard diplomatic escort, enough presence to remind everyone who they represented, not so much as to provoke. Pyrrhus had taken perhaps 10 steps toward the nearest ship when Adelais stopped abruptly. My lord. Something in his tone made Pyrrhus pause. He followed Adeliza's gaze across the port district, and saw it. The vessel dominated the far end of the dock like a predator among prey. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of their largest frigate, with a hull that seemed constructed from dark metal that caught the light strangely. But what truly captured attention was the storm. Crackling energy surrounded the ship like a living thing. Lightning arced and twisted in patterns that suggested containment rather than chaos, power held in check by deliberate design. The storm shield pulsed with barely restrained force, making the air shimmer with heat distortion. Pyrrhus stopped walking entirely. "What in the stars is that?" Adelais breathed. The Imperial soldiers had noticed now too. Their perfect formation wavered slightly as heads turned, as hands unconsciously moved toward weapons in response to the vessel's sheer, threatening presence. "A dreadnought," the man in black rags said softly, "or something like one, but I've never seen storm channeling on that scale." Pyrrhus's mind was racing. He prided himself on knowing things, on having intelligence that others lacked. The Empire's spy network was extensive, their surveillance of neighboring nations thorough. He had detailed reports on Ryugen's military capabilities, their naval assets, their infrastructure. None of those reports mentioned this. The thought carried weight. Implications. "Adelais," he said quietly, "what do we know about Ryugen's shipbuilding capacity?" "Limited, my lord." Adeliza's response was immediate. He'd memorized the same briefings. "They have adequate craftsmen, but they lack the industrial base for major vessel construction. Their fleet consists primarily of light escorts and cargo transports. Their largest military ship is the Mountain's Fist, a frigate approximately 60 meters in length." Pyrrhus looked at the dreadnought again. It had to be at least 150 meters long, possibly more. "That is not a light escort," he said dryly. "No, my lord." They stood in silence for a moment, Imperial envoys and soldiers alike staring at the impossible vessel sitting calmly in Ryugen's port. The storm shield crackled, sending shadows dancing across the dock. "Could they have purchased it?" one of the soldiers suggested hesitantly. "From whom?" Adelais countered. "The mercantile guilds don't sell vessels of that class. The Northern Confederacy doesn't have storm-channeling technology. The Southern Kingdoms are barely maintaining their own fleets after the succession wars." He paused. "Let's not even speak of Ryugen's incapability to establish relationships across continents." "Then they built it," another soldier said. "Impossible," Adelais said flatly. "We would have known. Construction of something that size takes years. Our surveillance would have detected it." The man in black rags was studying the ship with unsettling intensity. "Unless they built it somewhere else. Somewhere we weren't watching." Pyrrhus felt a cold prickle of unease. That was possible. Unlikely, but possible. If Ryugen had access to facilities outside their borders, if they'd been preparing in secret for years. But no. That required resources, connections, infrastructure. Things that left traces. Things the Empire would have noticed. "No," he said aloud, forcing confidence into his voice. "Look at it more carefully." The others turned to him, questioning. "The design is wrong for Ryugen. Too aggressive. Too foreign." Pyrrhus gestured toward the vessel, his analytical mind cataloging details even as unease settled in his chest. "This isn't their aesthetic. Their ships are built for mountain warfare, vertical maneuvering, quick ascents and descents. That thing is built for open sky dominance. For overwhelming force." He paused, analyzing the lines of the hull, the placement of the weapon systems, the configuration of the storm shield. "It's not theirs. Someone else brought it here." "Who?" Adelais asked. That was the question, wasn't it? Pyrrhus stared at the dreadnought, at the crackling energy that surrounded it like a crown of lightning, and felt the first stirrings of something he rarely experienced. Doubt. This changes things. The Emperor needs to know. Northern stood in the council hall with King Ruger. A handful of officials gathered around them in loose formation. The tension from the throne room hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had concentrated. settling into the stone walls like something physical. In all honesty, we do not have much intel about the Empire, the king admitted, let alone the emperor himself. There are records of histories that my predecessors wrote of their brief exchanges. The only thing that has always helped us from the brink of destruction was the mountain itself. He sighed, shifting his weight. Despite being a small nation, the mountain has aided us in times past, enough to have a back and forth with the Empire. Of course, in all those exchanges, we've never had to face the full force of their attack. It'd simply be pointless for them to bother so much over such a small nation. King Ruger leaned his head on his hand, the gesture suddenly making him look older, wearier. Which is why I truthfully do not understand why they seem ready to do just that now. Your Majesty, we can't be so sure yet, one of the officials cried out. What other confirmation could there be? The king's voice sharpened. If that young man came out to openly lure us, then the Empire must be backing his actions. Moreover, the number of envoys they came with, bringing that many soldiers into another king's throne room is already enough reason for them to be slaughtered. Like Lord Northern said, every one of their actions was coldly calculated for our response. At that moment, Prince Rieran bit down on his lip and lowered his head. I apologize, Father. The king exhaled and waved him off. You showed enough restraint, Rieran. I can't imagine what would have happened if your other 3 brothers were around. Ha! The Empire's army certainly would have perished in this throne room. The officials responded with knowing laughter, the sound echoing off the stone. The Ryugan brothers. Not exactly known for their emotional regulation, apparently. Northern believed he had seen them before, but he couldn't quite place faces to names anymore. And frankly, it didn't matter enough to bother. He exhaled. So there's no useful information? The king responded with forced optimism. Of course, if you go through the archives, I'm sure there's a wealth of knowledge about the Empire's armies. But about their emperor or even the imperial princes and princesses. He shook his head. There's none. I see. Disappointing. I was hoping to find something about my father. Maybe even my grandfather. The thought left a bitter taste, but he pushed it aside. Personal excavations could wait. The Empire wouldn't. Of course. Roma can help you go through the Grand Archives. You can search through everything. Roma was visibly taken aback by her father's declaration, by the sudden enthusiasm that had crept into his voice. Northern, meanwhile, found the offer quite agreeable. Something has to be useful in those archives. And who knows, I might get lucky. Stumble across some secret the old kings discovered and buried. He nodded. That's good. However, is it all right? You're practically giving me permission to access all of your archives. The king was thoughtfully silent for a moment. Then he smiled, the expression genuine, if tired. I believe you have a good heart. You saw the Empire's bullying and couldn't just let it go. I could see how you didn't want to interfere in all of this, but still, you did. You come off as a good person, Lord Rian. He paused, something curious entering his tone. Ha! Mind if I ask, your friends from before call you Northern, but you introduced yourself as Rian. I find Northern to be an intriguing name, while Rian is a dangerous one. Are you perhaps from the Northern continent? Northern exhaled. Talk about priorities. We're on the brink of war and he's curious about etymology. No. My father. He had an impeccable naming sense. Ah, I'm sure he's going to be a man of valor. I look forward to meeting him. Northern smiled coldly. The expression didn't reach his eyes. You really don't. I'm sure that meeting would be memorable, he said, his tone carefully neutral. But let's focus on the immediate problem. The Empire isn't going to wait while we sort through family introductions. The king nodded, missing the tension beneath Northern's words entirely. Of course. Roma, please escort Lord Rian Northern to the Grand Archives. Give him access to whatever he needs. Roma bowed slightly. Yes, father. She glanced at Northern, something thoughtful flickering in her expression. Shall we go now? Northern nodded. The sooner the better. Time isn't exactly on our side. As they moved toward the exit, the king called after them. Lord Northern, when you're finished with your research, please join us for evening meal. It's the least we can offer after everything today. Northern paused, half-turned. We'll see. I need to check on my people first. Make sure they've collected Abyss Tyrant without incident. Of course. The invitation stands regardless. Northern and Roma walked out of the throne room in silence, the weight of the day's events settling between them like something physical. The corridors felt quieter now, emptier. Most of the palace guard had been dismissed, though Northern noticed increased patrols moving through the halls. Nervous energy trying very hard to pretend at normalcy. They descended several levels, moving deeper into the mountain's heart. The architecture shifted gradually from ceremonial grandeur to functional austerity. Fewer decorations, more bare stone, the kind of spaces built for purpose rather than impression. You're quiet, Roma observed finally. Thinking. About. Northern considered how much to share. About what the Empire wants. About why now. He paused. About whether this conflict was always inevitable or if something specific triggered it. Roma was silent for several steps. My father thinks it's the Ethereum, that they've finally decided our resources are worth the effort of conquest. Maybe, Northern said, but the timing bothers me. The Empire has known about your Ethereum for generations. So why now? Would they send such an obviously provocative envoy unless they were ready for large-scale war? And is this really about Ryugen? He let the question hang. Or did they just want to show you, clearly and unmistakably, what they could have done from the beginning if they'd wanted to, while they prepare for something else entirely? Roma stopped walking. She turned to him, her expression stern, guarded. Why would you think this? Northern stepped closer, his gaze flat and unreadable. Roma, there's a possibility that the Empire isn't just targeting Ryugen. They might be starting something much larger. A continental crusade. He let that sink in. And Ryugen is just their first march. She frowned, the words visibly unsettling her. What? Northern looked at her, his voice viciously flat despite the tension coiling beneath it. Riem Guard. They're about to try to conquer the entire continent. He paused. I think. The news shook Roma to her core. Even as they walked forward, she was still processing it. Northern could see it in the way her gaze kept drifting, her steps slightly uneven. They reached a massive set of doors, ancient wood bound with metal that had oxidized into patterns like frozen lightning. Runes covered every surface, glowing faintly with residual essence that pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythms. The light reminded Northern of a heartbeat, something alive, waiting. Roma placed her hand against a specific sigil. The doors groaned open, revealing darkness beyond. Welcome to the Grand Archives, she said quietly. Northern stepped through the doorway. Essence crystals flickered to life automatically, spreading in waves that revealed the true scope of the space before him. The Grand Archives weren't just large. They were impossible. The chamber stretched upward for what had to be hundreds of feet. Maybe more. Northern couldn't see the ceiling clearly even with the essence lighting. Just shadows layered on shadows until the darkness swallowed everything. Shelves lined the walls in ascending tiers, connected by staircases and bridges and platforms that seemed to defy reasonable architectural planning. Some sections jutted out at odd angles. Others spiraled inward. A few appeared to be carved directly into the mountain face, creating alcoves and grottos filled with yet more volumes. And the books themselves. There were thousands of them. Tens of thousands, possibly more. They filled every available surface, stacked on shelves, piled on tables, organized in systems that probably made sense to someone but looked utterly chaotic to Northern's eyes. The smell hit him next. Old paper, leather, dust, and something faintly metallic. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, all compressed into one space. This is going to take forever. Everything Ryugen has ever recorded is in here, Roma said, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space. Histories, treaties, military assessments, personal journals, trade records, Mining surveys, monster catalogs. She paused, gesturing broadly. And not just our own records. We've collected knowledge from across the continent for centuries. Purchased archives from fallen kingdoms. Copied texts from traveling scholars. Salvaged histories from rifts. Northern was already moving deeper into the space, his analytical mind trying to process the sheer volume of information contained here. Every shelf represented months of reading. Every alcove, years. The scope was staggering, and somewhere in all of it was exactly what he needed. "Where do I even start?" he muttered. Roma moved to a central desk where several thick ledgers sat, their spines cracked with age and frequent use. These are the indices, organized by topic, time period, and source. She opened one, dust motes swirling in the crystal light. "What specifically are you looking for?" Northern thought about that carefully. The Empire, my father, military capabilities, political structure, weaknesses. But he couldn't be that direct. Not yet. Roma was an ally, but some questions would raise others he wasn't ready to answer. "Everything," he said finally. "I need context, history, patterns. The Empire didn't become what it is overnight. There's a progression, a methodology, and somewhere in all of this," he gestured at the archives, "there's information that will tell me how they think, how they operate, the might of their army." Roma looked at him with something between concern and fascination. "That could take weeks, months, even. Then I'd better get started." Northern walked to an open area near the center of the archives, closed his eyes, drew on his essence. "You're using True Clone." The activation was smooth, practiced. 10 perfect copies of himself materialized in the space around him, each one sharing his memories, his knowledge, his purpose. They looked at each other briefly, a moment of synchronized understanding, then scattered without a word. Roma gasped softly. "Ah!" Northern watched her expression shift from shock to something more measured. She'd recovered quickly, faster than most would. "Talent, ability," Northern said simply. "I'm not sure you've seen this one. Have you?" She shook her head, but there was calculation in her eyes now. Filing this information away. He glanced at her. "This is the most efficient way to process large amounts of information quickly." The clones were already climbing ladders, pulling books from shelves, settling into reading positions across multiple levels of the archives. Northern himself moved toward a section marked with symbols he recognized as historical records. "This is..." Roma trailed off, watching as 10 Northerns simultaneously began researching. "This is incredible." "It's practical," Northern corrected, already pulling volumes from a shelf. The leather was cool against his fingers, the binding surprisingly intact despite its age. "Now you should probably go. Check on your father, help with defensive preparations. I'll be here for a while." Roma hesitated. "Are you sure you don't need?" "I'm fine." Northern opened the first book without looking at her. "Really? This is what I'm good at." She lingered another moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll check on you later. Make sure you haven't been buried by falling books." Northern made a non-committal sound, already absorbed in the text before him. Roma's footsteps echoed away. The doors closed with a heavy thud, and Northern was alone with his clones and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Finally, there was so much he was looking forward to discovering here today. Minerals, crafting techniques, military formations, trade routes. All of it useful. All of it valuable. But those were secondary objectives, bonuses stacked on top of what he actually needed. His main concern remained whether he could finish reading everything in time. Suddenly, Northern had an idea. He narrowed his eyes and leaned away from the book. "Aoi." "Yes. Is it possible to copy this entire library and all the books and put them in SoulForge?" "Technically, yes. You can copy the books as physical objects. Shingon can analyze their structure and Demon of Form can store those blueprints, just as you copied sand. However, this would be functionally useless for your current purpose." Northern frowned. "Explain." "When you copy an inanimate object, You gain its physical form, structure, material composition, properties. If you copied a book, you would gain the ability to transform into that book or summon book echoes. What you would not gain is the information written inside it. The knowledge isn't part of the form. Correct. The text is surface-level inscription, not intrinsic to the object's essence or structure. A book's form is paper, binding, and ink arranged in a specific configuration, but the meaning of the words is interpretive information, not physical property. Copying a dragon gives you its fire breath because that ability is biological. Copying a book gives you paper and ink. Northern absorbed that. It made sense even if it was inconvenient. And storing them physically in SoulForge? Your SoulForge is currently level 2 of 10, optimized for storing and organizing forms and echoes as combat assets. It is not yet developed as general-purpose dimensional storage. The 70 square kilometer space is structured around training with copied forms, not warehousing physical objects. That functionality may emerge at higher mastery levels when the forge evolves into a more complex environment. Northern glanced at his clones, already processing hundreds of pages across multiple floors. So reading is still the most efficient method. By several orders of magnitude, your 10 clones with perfect memory retention will absorb and retain the information content, which is what you actually need. Copying the books would give you the ability to become literature, which serves no tactical purpose. Good enough. He dove back into the text and let the knowledge consume him. Time passed strangely in the archives. The essence lighting never changed. A constant amber glow that offered no hint of morning or evening. No windows showed the movement of the sun. Northern and his clones read, absorbed, cross-referenced, built mental maps of information that spread and connected and formed patterns across centuries of recorded history. He didn't notice when hours became half a day. Didn't notice when he would subconsciously create more clones to reach more books because all available copies were already occupied. The pursuit of knowledge, as it seemed, was something Northern had failed to consider would be so consuming. He'd expected useful information, strategic advantages. Instead, he found himself genuinely fascinated, drawn deeper and deeper into texts he had no practical reason to read, simply because they existed and he could. Enough to have him so lost, so much that he noticed nothing aside from the steady accumulation of knowledge. Until Roma's voice cut through his concentration. Northern. He looked up from a military logistics manual. But he wasn't the only one who turned at the call of his name. All the clones, regardless of their position, took a pause. Some were reading on ladders. Some were floating in the open air because no ladder reached that high. Others walked among the colossal shelves, muttering to themselves as they studied, their voices overlapping into a strange harmony of his own thoughts spoken aloud. I look like a madman, he realized. A very productive madman, but still. Northern himself was perched on a particular ladder closer to the reading section. He blinked and realized his eyes were burning slightly from reading in the essence light for however long it had been. The discomfort registered only now when the focus broke. Roma stood at the base of his ladder, looking up at him with concern. Your friends came looking for you, she said. They're worried. They've been expecting you back at the ship. And they also said, your father is awake. Her expression shifted to displeasure. Why didn't you mention your father was here? Northern processed that information with the same analytical distance he'd applied to everything else today. Father's awake. Good. That's good. The thought felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Hours ago, she said. So it's been 6 hours? 8? More. He furrowed his brows and squinted, then looked at Roma. Because it wasn't important. Tell them I'm fine, he said. I'll be there eventually. Roma frowned. Northern, you need to. Actually, Northern interrupted, already making the decision. I'll send someone. He activated True Clone again. Another perfect copy materialized beside him on the ladder, causing Roma to jump slightly despite having witnessed this multiple times now. The clone simply flew down with a gentle smile on his face, landing softly before Roma. whose expression had frozen yet again. "Shall we?" Roma stuttered subtly. I guess." But she glanced back at Northern on the ladder, the one who had spoken to her. "You're going to keep reading," she said flatly. "Yes." "For how long?" "Until I find what I need." Northern was already turning back to his book. "Or until I've read everything. Whichever comes first." "That could take days." "Then it takes days." He didn't look at her. "The Empire won't wait, Roma. But they also won't attack immediately. Pyrrhus needs to return, deliver his report, receive orders. That gives me time, and I'm going to use every second of it." Roma was silent for a long moment. "You're very focused." "I'm very motivated," Northern corrected. "There's a difference." She narrowed her eyes. "Why? I don't understand. Don't you have other priorities?" Northern spoke without averting his gaze from the book. "Which would include returning to South Drywall, retiring to a place of my own, sleeping for a long time, really long, on an actually soft and comfortable bed, waking to fresh morning sun and bathing in a clean lake a few times." He glanced at Roma briefly. "If you have any recommendations, please share. I'm willing to travel just to take a proper bath." He breathed for a moment, and his brows drew tighter. "But all of that won't be possible if the Empire's forces begin raiding the continent, right?" She nodded. "Yes, you're right." Northern smiled simply and added, "Aside from the fact that I'm enjoying this, everything I need right now is currently here with me. Have you explored the inside of Thunderhead? It's like a mansion, and I have an even better model. I can practically live in the sky." He paused. "Not that I want to. Stars, I'm babbling. Roma, leave before you distract me more than this." She looked at him with a mix of a smile and worried concern. "I guess you really are enjoying yourself. Well then, I'll check up on you later to inform you how many hours have passed." He waved her off like she was some insect disturbing his work. He heard her sigh, then her footsteps as she walked away, then the sound of the doors closing behind her. Northern dismissed her from his thoughts and dove back into the text. He read through the military manual and another and another. Every text recorded in terrifying detail every encounter with the Empire's armies. And truly, Northern had to admit how terrifying it was. The ancient Ryugan had worked desperately to build traps into the mountains, using the terrain itself as a defensive force to turn the battle tide. There was one particular engagement where they had even depended on the Rift forecast system, not to win exactly but simply to avoid losing. When the Rift broke open, the terrain changed so drastically that the Empire forces backed off. It later took 17 masters and a sage to clear that rift. 7 died. 3 were injured so gravely they retired from active service entirely. This also reflected the struggles of the past, how genuinely they had fought against the rifts appearing throughout their era. A Tier 8 rift, of course, but still. The history from Milgard Academy made their era sound heroic. Legendary. As though everyone born then was somehow special. Northern turned another page, his thoughts growing heavier. But when I contrast that era with the present one, the only thing I see are weaklings. And this must have been exactly how Ruffsburg saw the world. How Milwa himself saw it. But through this lens, the actual records, not the sanitized Academy versions, he saw something else entirely. The struggles, the determination, people whose talent class never stopped them from becoming something more. Many died. Many died as heroes in rifts and battles with the Empire, names recorded only in logistics reports and casualty lists. But because they weren't paragons or luminaries or transcendents, history seemed not to remember them. At that moment, Northern couldn't help but think how strength really equaled significance. How it always had. Strength can be anything, he thought, staring at a list of the dead. That's what they tell us. But in a world like Trarel, where strength has been canonized into tiers and classes and rankings, anything becomes very limited indeed. If one wasn't careful, all that potential, all that effort, could truly turn out to be effortless. Meaningless. He turned another page and kept reading. Northern continued to rummage through the archives, creating piles of promising texts while leaving clones to study the more specialized works. Treatises on minerals, monster materials, rift formations. He left them to their task while he focused on what mattered most. History. Every corner of it he could find. After dropping one more book onto the growing stack, he used wind manipulation to control several others, letting them drift and orbit around him in lazy circles. His eyes swept across their spines, and then caught on something different. This book had a worn leather binding, its surface cracked and weathered in a way that looked completely out of place among the pristine archive texts. Now what are you? Curiosity tugged at him, and naturally the book drifted toward his outstretched hand. He took it and examined it more closely. The quality of the leather was rough. Too rough, almost primitive compared to the refined craftsmanship elsewhere in the library. There was something inscribed on the cover, though time had worn most of it away. The surface looked almost scoured clean, as if years of handling had rubbed the inscription into near invisibility. Northern squinted, tilting the book toward better light. He could still make out faint outlines beneath the weathering. His brows furrowed as he traced them with his gaze. The symbols were the same language from the wooden chains at the floating oasis, the place Anike had taken him to, the same language Aoi used. It read, "On the Nakari and they're coming." Ha! About time. Northern settled onto the ladder's top rung, letting his legs dangle over empty air as he opened the worn cover. The spine creaked softly, releasing the faint musty scent of age. The pages inside were strange. Not paper. Something thinner, more fibrous, with a texture that reminded him of pressed plant matter, perhaps reed or bark. The ink had faded to a brownish hue over what must have been centuries, but the words remained legible. With a curl of a smile tugging at his lips, he began to read. The Morgan texts, Fragment I, on the Nakari and their coming. In the time before time was counted there was only man. Man who was weak. Man who died easy and quick like grass in fire season. This is known. This is what the elders say and what their elders said before. But the stars watched. Elphak watched most of all. Northern paused. Elphak. Since Anike had explained Elphak's constellation significance, along with the other 11, it was important to note this presence now. The luminant star appearing in a text this old, speaking of bloodlines and gifts, he kept reading. Elphak, who is called the luminant star by some and the burning eye by others, and many names besides that are not written here because I do not know them all. Elphak saw mankind and saw their weakness and saw something else too. What Elphak saw is not recorded. Perhaps want. Perhaps loneliness. Perhaps something that stars feel that men cannot name. What is known is this. Elphak came down, or sent down apart, or reached down. The texts do not agree and I write what I find. From this union came the bloodline of the Nakari. The Nakari who are not men but are of men. The Nakari who are not star but carry star within. Two kinds there were from the beginning and two kinds there remain. The Rikis, they who received the body gift. The Beja, they who received the soul gift. I will write of each. A small frown creased his brow. Two bloodlines, two different gifts, body and soul. Northern silenced his racing thoughts and continued to read. On the Rikis are the children of strength. This is said wrong. They are the children of Elphak, same as Beja. But their gift settled in the body and so they are called children of strength by common folk who do not know the proper terms. A Riki is stronger than 10 men. Some say 20. The oldest texts say 100, but I think this is exaggeration from writers who wish to impress their lords. Still, stronger than men by far. But this is not all. The Rikis possess what is called body abilities. These are not talents. This must be understood clear. A talent is given by the primordials and measured and ranked. A body ability is something other. Something that comes from the blood. From Elphak's gift passed down through generations. One Riki may have skin that turns hard as stone when struck. Another may heal wounds that would kill lesser men. Another may move with speed that the eye cannot follow. These gifts vary. They are not chosen. They are born with. Northern stopped reading. Something vital clicked into place. Ah! Formless. What if formless wasn't random? What if it was his gift, the one attributed to his body, passed down through blood rather than granted through awakening? But that didn't quite make sense either. He'd had the all-seeing eyes from the beginning. Wasn't that a bloodline gift of some sort? But then, that was more attributed to the Asgardians. Then maybe the Asgardians were Beja? No, can't be. They wouldn't let their bloodline spread that loosely. But then again, if one thought about it, the Empire had wanted to destroy the Asgardians. And that too for no justifiable reason anyone had ever explained to him. Northern's frown deepened. He set that thread of curiosity aside for now, focusing instead on the more immediate question burning through his mind. If I recall correctly, my body shouldn't have been able to hold both chaos and void, but it did. Even the Chaos Prince mentioned it. The evolutions my body has undergone, completely outside my talent's abilities, this could explain it. The Reiki's bloodline runs in me after all. His grip tightened on the ancient text, a surge of excitement coursing through him. Of course, this also meant that every one of his half-brothers and sisters, the entire imperial family, probably possessed unique bloodline gifts that had nothing to do with their talents. Finally, all the scattered pieces from years of questions seemed to be falling into place. Northern was glad, genuinely glad. He fixed his eyes on the page and immediately continued to read. Some Reikis have weak body abilities. Some have strong. Some have abilities that seem useless until the moment they are needed most. There is no pattern that has been found, though many have tried and many have failed and many have written long scripts about their failure which I have read and found mostly useless. The Reikis were warriors in the old times. This is natural. What else would you do with such strength? They guarded the Morgan borders. They fought in the wars that are not written of in common histories, wars that predated even the beginning of the first civilization, the Echo Realm, the Origins. They died in numbers that would have ended any normal bloodline. But they did not end. They are still here. Fewer now. Mixed with common blood over generations so that the gifts run thin in some families and strong in others. But still here. Still carrying Elfok's body gift in their bones. On the Beja are harder to write of. The body can be seen. The soul cannot. Where the Reikis received strength of flesh, the Beja received strength of spirit. Soul gift is what the old texts call it. I do not know if soul is the right word. The Morgan tongue had a different term that does not translate clean. Something like soul but also like essence and also like the part that sees what is real. I use soul because it is close enough and because I do not know a better word. The Beja have abilities of the soul. Like the Reikis, these are separate from talents. Born with, inherited through blood. But here is the strange thing. The soul gifts of the Beja most often show through their eyes. Northern's breath caught. He read the line again, the faded ink seeming sharper now, more immediate. The soul gifts of the Beja most often show through their eyes. All eyes that later evolved to Liel, and then Chaos Eyes, and was now Shingon the Demon Eye. Does that mean I'm Beja? No. All Asgardians are Beja. The connection was obvious once he saw it. So obvious he almost laughed. If the ancient emperor of Riemgard had married an Asgardian, this might have been exactly what they were trying to bring forth. A union of bloodlines, a deliberate mingling of gifts. However, this made Northern think. Was he going to be the only bastard of the emperor? The only experiment? He didn't think so. The realization didn't crash into him. It settled, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Like something he'd always known but never had words for. He kept reading, hungry now. Why this is I cannot say. Perhaps because eyes are where the soul looks out from. Perhaps because Elfok was called the Burning Eye and so the gift naturally settles there. Perhaps for reasons that stars know and men do not. A Beja may have eyes that see truth from lies. Another may have eyes that see the flow of essence in all things. Another may have eyes that can look upon a man and know his talent without being told. Another may have eyes that do things I cannot describe because the texts use words I do not understand. These eye abilities became famous. So famous that in later times the Beja came to be known by another name. The Asgardians. Northern closed his eyes. Ah! When Anik used it, he had assumed it was a clan name, a regional designation, some obscure family line from a forgotten northern corner of the world. Not this. Not star-touched. Not the descendants of a union between humanity and a celestial being. Not an ancient race that predated recorded history. He sat with that knowledge for a moment, feeling it reshape the architecture of everything he thought he understood. The term had always seemed so ordinary when Anik spoke it. Just another label. Just another way of saying different. I don't think even Anik knows about this. He opened his eyes and continued. I do not know why this name. The texts do not explain. Perhaps there was a place called Asgard where many Beja lived. Perhaps it was the name of a great Beja hero. Perhaps it is a word from a language older than the Morgan tongue. I write what I find and I find no explanation. What I find is this. Over generations the term Eyes of Asgard or Asgardian Eyes came to mean any Beja who possessed strong eye abilities. And then over more generations the term grew to cover all Beja whether their soul gift showed in their eyes or not. And then over more generations still the original name Beja began to fade from common use until only scholars remembered it. Now most say Asgardian and do not know they are speaking of the Beja. Do not know they are speaking of Elfox children. Do not know anything of the Nakari or the luminant star or the union that created a new kind of being. This is why I write, so that what is known does not become unknown. This scribe understood something important. Knowledge died. Names faded. Meanings drifted until the original truth was buried under layers of assumption and convenience. The Beja became Asgardians and no one remembered why. The Nakari became legend and then myth and then nothing at all. Except here. In this worn book with its rough leather cover and its fading ink, tucked away in an archive that most people would never think to search. Northern turned the page. On the mixing, some will ask, can a Reiki and Beja produce children together? Yes, this has happened. This happens still. What comes from such union is not predictable. Sometimes the child is Reiki with body gifts only. Sometimes Beja with soul gifts only. Sometimes neither. Sometimes, and this is rare, both. Northern's body went stiff. This had been something he was just thinking about. If the Beja and Reikis were mixing from time past, there was a chance that the purity of their bloodline could not be compared to the days of old anymore. The gifts would have diluted, scattered. Some lines would carry strength, others only echoes. But that wasn't what made his spine tighten. He also had to consider that the former emperor of Riemgard had pursued the Asgardians to the brink of extinction and used whatever was left of them to formulate bastards that were separate from the Reiki bloodlines, possibly trying to bring back the strength of whatever came from the union between Reikis and Beja. And whatever it was, let's read further before concluding. A child with both gifts is called different things in different texts. Half-blessed, twice-touched, full Nakari. I have seen one text that calls them complete, as if the single-gifted Nakari are somehow incomplete, which I think is wrong and possibly insulting, but I record it anyway because that is my purpose here. These dual-gifted children are rare. Very rare. 1 in 1,000 unions, perhaps. Perhaps less. The texts do not agree on numbers, and I suspect no one actually counted. What is agreed is this: dual-gifted Nakari are powerful. Sometimes too powerful that they are considered a different race from humanity. Something demonic. There are stories of such children who could not control their gifts and destroyed themselves and much around them. There are other stories of such children who became great heroes or great villains depending on who is telling. I do not include these stories here. They are too long and I am running out of good ink. Northern let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Running out of ink. Here was this ancient scribe, recording knowledge that could reshape Northern's understanding of himself, of his family, of his entire bloodline, and they were worried about ink. About practical concerns. About the simple, mundane reality of a lamp burning low and a hand growing tired. Something about that felt grounding. Real. A reminder that even world-shaking truths were written by ordinary people with ordinary problems. I think I would have liked this person. He read the final section. Final words on this fragment. I have written what I know of the Nakari. of the Rikis and their body gifts, of the Beja and their soul gifts and their eyes and their later name of Asgardian. There is more to write. The wars, the scattering, the mixing with common blood, the families that still carry strong gifts, the families that have forgotten what they are. But my hand is tired and the lamp burns low. I will write more when I am able, if I am able. These are uncertain times and I do not know what tomorrow brings. What I know is this: the N'Kari are real. Elphok's gift is real. The blood remembers even when the mind forgets. This is what I have learned. This is what I leave for those who come after. May they read better than I write. Northern closed the book. He sat there for a long moment, the worn leather warm against his palms, the weight of the text heavier than its physical form had any right to be. The silence of the archive pressed in around him, dust motes drifting in the lamplight, the faint smell of aged paper and old bindings. The blood remembers even when the mind forgets. He ran his thumb along the book's spine, feeling the texture of centuries-old leather beneath his skin. Somewhere in the distant past, a scribe had sat just like this, tired, running low on ink, uncertain about tomorrow, and had chosen to write anyway. Chosen to preserve what they knew so that someone someday might find it. And Northern had found it. Thank you, he thought, though he didn't know who he was thanking. The scribe, maybe, or Elphok, or whatever strange convergence of fate had led him to this archive, to this shelf, to this exact book. He tucked the volume carefully into his pack and stood. There was more to learn, more to understand. But for now, this was enough. This was a beginning. I'll find the remaining fragments. After Northern returned to the Thunderhead Dreadnought, he finally met Shin, who looked like he had fought death itself and, by some divine miracle, survived. Northern was particularly confused because all of Shin's bodily injuries had somehow healed. The only problem was that he wasn't waking up, which had led him to conclude that whatever the Patriarch had done was probably more mental than physical. And Braham's seemingly amazing talent actually could not heal non-physical wounds. Quite a funny but sensible limitation. The room was sparse. There was only Aisha with Silver in her arms, sitting on a wooden chair placed beside Shin's bed. That had been her station, where she'd sat, slept, and nursed him until he woke up. The second chair, along with its round table, sat in the center of the large room. There was a coffee table nearby, polished ceramic gleaming under the lamplight, a large brown couch pressed against the far wall, and a vast rug with delicate, intertwining designs sprawled across the floor. The room was a great flex, and it had all come with the Thunderhead Dreadnought package. It was as though when the Tower of Trammel was copied and evolved, everything inside it followed that same line of transformation. It made Northern almost confused why he couldn't copy a damn book. Of course, the Tower of Trammel, even if it didn't particularly have a soul, had an essence signature. If somehow, through research, he could find a way to create a library with an essence signature, perhaps he would be able to construct something similar. A library that consumed books and knowledge, upgrading itself perpetually. He had the Tower of Trammel as a model for that. But for now, his focus was his parents. Northern sat on the other chair, looking carefully at Shin. There was actual care and concern in his eyes as he studied his father's pale face, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "How do you feel?" Shin coughed, then grinned. "What?" His voice was hoarse, almost straining to form words, but it didn't lose that cocky edge he always carried. "You think I'm going to die from something like this?" He coughed again. Aisha shot him a glare that communicated everything. "You know you shouldn't be doing that." He leaned back with a long exhale. "HAA." Northern smiled. "You should take as much rest as possible. We have time." Shin nodded and gave him a thumbs up. Afterward, Northern's smile lingered. Aisha's eyes met his, and there was a silent communication in them too. One Northern didn't quite get at first, but then he could see it. She looked worried and wanted to talk, but didn't want Shin to overhear whatever it was. All his suspicions were confirmed when she stood up, cradling Silver in her arms, and gestured for both of them to step outside. Northern followed her lead. She closed the door behind them, and they stood in a passageway lined with cabin doors, walking toward the end where a short staircase led to the upper level of the airship. "I saw a fleet of Empire ships earlier," she said, her tone careful but concerned. "What are they about?" Northern smiled. "I knew this was coming. Realmguard Empire sent some envoys to Ryujin. The main reason, based on my observation, is to bait Ryujin and create a narrative justification for the violence they're planning." Aisha looked even more worried now. "And it worked." The first prince fell for it. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. "And now, I'm sure the Empire will most likely march here soon." They reached the thick metallic railing of the stairs. Beyond it, a transparent floor panel gave a glimpse into the colossal assemblage of engines that powered the vessel. Gears the size of carriages turning in synchronized rhythm, steam venting through copper pipes. Northern sighed. Then his gaze turned sharp. "But all of that is bull crap. The Empire knows exactly what they're doing. And I think they may be pushing for domination of the whole Central Plains." His brow furrowed. "What I don't understand is why. Is my supposed true father really that greedy?" Aisha cradled Silver gently, soothing her as thin cries began to rise. "Well, don't think too much about it for now." Her voice was soft but steady. "Everyone in their own world has a justifiable reason for the things they do. Although reasons don't often excuse the consequences of certain actions, it does beg us to at least understand them." She smiled. "I'm sure this would be a great moment for you, for all of us, to confront ourselves too. But beyond that, we need to survive. Stay alive." Her gaze turned sharp, gaining a striking resemblance to Northern's own expression just moments before. "So, tell me whatever it is that you need. I have relationships with people. There are some elven ones out there too, and they respect me. They've been preparing an insurgency army for when we finally get the opportunity to strike at Stuart. But if you need them, I can pull them in for you." Northern looked at his mother. Surprised, intrigued, grateful, amazed, all of it crashing through him at once. "She's been preparing for this. All this time." She continued, Your father here also has relationships. More bad than good, but good nonetheless. People who owe their lives to him." She tilted her head slightly. "We spent almost 10 years of our lives being travelers, you know?" It was difficult to erase the stunned expression from his face. His mother's gaze only grew more stern. "You're not alone, Laurel." He smiled, a real one, warm and full. "Of course I'm not. I have a wonderful mother such as you." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, then hugged her carefully, mindful of Silver nestled between them. The baby squirmed but didn't cry. "Thank you, Mother." He pulled away and asked, "Oh, right? Is it okay if we stay in Ryujin for a few days?" "I don't know. It may bleed into months." She smiled and tilted her head. "Oh boy. Do you still not realize?" Her voice carried gentle amusement. "It's fine as long as we're here." She caressed Silver's cheek softly. "Silver is. Your father is. You are. This is home as far as I'm concerned." Northern smiled. "Good. So, what do you want to do?" Northern thought for a moment, then responded. "I should speak with the king first. If we can secure a piece of land, I can establish our base there. Then I should send a message to the others." There was a blue spark of passion in his eyes, something fierce and determined kindling to life. "Let's make the Empire piss their pants." Later in the night, everyone was invited off the ship to attend a banquet with the king and his people. The hall was vast and the tables stretched endlessly, laden with delicacies that Northern himself had never imagined existed. There were what looked like crabs but weren't exactly crabs. They were rather squishy, and one's teeth just sank into them, spilling juice that tasted like honeyed wine. Roasted birds glazed with something iridescent. Steaming bowls of broth that smelled like morning fog over a forest. Bread that was somehow both crispy and impossibly soft. The ceiling arched high above them, painted with murals of lonks and ancient warriors whose names had probably been forgotten centuries ago. Lanterns hung from chains, casting warm golden light across the faces gathered around the table. Northern sat near the head, positioned deliberately, close enough to the king to speak, far enough to not seem presumptuous. A careful calculation, the kind of distance that said, "I belong here," without saying, "I think I'm your equal." Sale, along with everyone else, was seated 3 places down. They had apparently decided that diplomacy meant eating everything in sight. Nasira alone had already gone through what Northern estimated to be her body weight in food and showed no signs of stopping. "You're going to rupture something," Northern commented idly. She didn't even look up. "Impossible." She shoved another handful of something purple and gelatinous into her mouth. "Besides, when's the last time we had food that wasn't dried meat or whatever Shay burned?" "I heard that," Shay said from across the table, though he didn't seem particularly offended. He was picking at his plate with more restraint, eyes occasionally flicking toward the Ryugan guards positioned near the walls. Ellis sat beside him, looking relaxed and free of all burden as he enjoyed the food delicately. Sale was examining a piece of fruit with the intensity of someone trying to determine if it was poisonous or merely ugly. "This has teeth marks," he announced. "It's supposed to," one of the Ryugan servants clarified gently. "The biting pear. A delicacy." Sale stared at him, then at the fruit, then ate it anyway. Northern's mother sat further down with Silver, conversing quietly with one of the Ryugan noblewomen who seemed utterly fascinated by the baby. Shin remained on the ship. Aisha had refused to let him attend, citing that if he coughed up blood at a diplomatic dinner, it would set a bad precedent. Northern couldn't argue with that logic. The king of Ryugan sat at the head of the table. His son, Prince Rieran, the one who had fallen for the Empire's obvious bait, was notably absent. Northern suspected that was intentional. A father's quiet punishment, perhaps, or simply shame kept behind closed doors where foreign eyes couldn't witness it. "You eat little for someone who requested this feast," King Ruger observed, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned to say nothing while appearing to say something. Northern set down his chopsticks. "I find that overeating before difficult conversations dulls the mind." Difficult conversations. The king's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. "Is that what this is to be?" "That depends entirely on you, Your Majesty." The ambient noise of the banquet continued. Nasira's enthusiastic chewing, the clink of cups, murmured conversations between Ryugan nobles and Northern's companions. But there was a subtle shift, a sharpening of attention from those close enough to hear. Northern met the king's gaze directly. "I want land." King Ruger blinked. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't that. "Land," he repeated. "A territory, not particularly large. Somewhere with defensible terrain, preferably. Access to water would be nice but isn't essential. I can work with Baron if necessary." The king's eyebrows rose slightly. "You want me to grant you territory in Ryugan?" "Yes." "And in exchange?" Northern leaned back in his chair. "In exchange, when the Riemgard Empire marches, and they will march, Your Majesty, we both know this, you'll have something they don't expect. Something that will make them reconsider their timeline, their strategy, possibly their entire campaign." "And what would that be?" Northern smiled. It wasn't a particularly warm expression. "Me." Silence settled over their end of the table. Then King Ruger laughed. A short, sharp sound that held more exhaustion than humor. "Indeed. Indeed." He nodded slowly. "Lord Northern, you alone would be a significant addition to our ranks." His expression shifted, something guarded sliding into place. "But you can't be too certain I'm even considering war." Northern frowned. "So you intend to give up without a fight?" King Ruger looked down for a moment, then smiled. It was a smile that Northern did not like. A smile of weakness disguised as sacrifice. "I merely put my people first." He breathed slowly. "It burns my heart to watch my people die." Northern kept his expression neutral, but something cold settled in his chest. The words sounded noble on the surface, but beneath them was something else entirely. Something that bordered on childlike, naive. But the man was still speaking. "I'm sure you noticed Roma is not here tonight, nor her brother." The other 3 princes have not been around either. Northern nodded, paying close attention. It's because the prince and princess are nursing their sick mother. The 3 princes, they've been searching for a cure to her disease, using the connections we have with Cavelin Citadel. But they've been hitting a dead wall. He spoke wistfully now, his voice losing the practiced cadence of a king and becoming something rawer, something more human. Roma had also run away from home for the same reason, tracing a certain stimulant in order to find the source so she could identify the origination of the disease. But the disaster at Lithia overshadowed so many things. I had to prioritize her safety. The man smiled coldly, painfully, and looked away from Northern. Lord Northern, I'm a very selfish man. I love my country. A pause. But I love my wife more. If giving Ryugen to the Empire will stop unnecessary death and give me more time to care for my wife, I'm willing to do that. He sighed, the weight of it audible. I'm unfit to be king, Lord Northern. Northern stared at him, genuinely dumbfounded. He doesn't have the will to fight. Not because he's weak, because he's already grieving. He's chosen his wife over his kingdom, and he's made peace with that choice. He's not asking for my help. He's explaining why he won't accept it. The realization hit him like cold water. This is a crisis. Northern was stunned into silence. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, finding nothing. For several long seconds, he simply sat there, the noise of the feast washing over him like distant waves. Then he reeled himself back into control. All can't be lost. This is about his wife. I should be able to heal her. But there's something else first. Northern fixed the king with an intent look. So, you don't want to fight the Empire and wish to abandon your people, because your wife is dying. There was something in his voice as he addressed the king. Something tinged with scorn he didn't bother to hide. King Ruger seemed to sense it. A somber smile lingered on his lips, his gaze drifting to the large flat fish on his table. A thing the size of 3 palms pressed together, its glazed skin reflecting the candlelight. Lord Northern, have you ever led? Northern's gaze stayed straight. Serious. That's not what I'm talking to you about, Your Majesty. We are not the same, and this is certainly not about me. His expression darkened. You were raised to lead. You are a king. To betray your people for such a thing as love. Don't tell me you thought it was justifiable? King Ruger's face twisted, the look of a man who had swallowed something bitter and couldn't wash away the taste. Around them, the other guests dove into the feast with the same enthusiasm they dove into conversation. Laughter rippled across nearby tables. Cups clinked. The atmosphere swallowed their exchange whole, drowning it in revelry. No one would have guessed that a boy not yet 17, a boy who had never worn a crown, was about to lecture a 57-year-old king on the weight of his own throne. But Northern paused before doing so. He had to consider that this man had been a king his entire adult life, had been shaped for this role, molded into it. This was his purpose, and everything else came secondary. He also had to consider the experience behind that crown. King Ruger had ruled for at least 20 years. Before that, he would have watched his own father rule for decades more. If after all of that, all those years, all that experience, he still thinks surrendering the kingdom is a worthy option, then either there's something I'm missing, or everything I'm about to say is something he's already heard and dismissed. Northern's fingers drummed once against the table, twice, then stopped. Standard arguments won't work here. He's already heard them, already dismissed them. He studied the king's profile in the flickering light. The slump of shoulders that had probably once been proud. The way his eyes kept drifting toward nothing, seeing something that wasn't in this room. Someone who wasn't at this table. He's already grieving, not just for his wife, for his kingdom too. He's mourned it in advance so the actual loss won't hurt as much. Northern understood that particular psychological defense mechanism intimately. But understanding it doesn't make it less foolish. Your Majesty, Northern said finally, his voice low enough to stay between them but firm enough to command attention. I'm going to say something, and I need you to actually hear it. not as a king hearing a foreigner, as a man hearing another man. King Ruger's gaze lifted. Something flickered behind the exhaustion. A spark of attention, perhaps, or just surprise. You've constructed a narrative in your head, Northern continued. A story where surrendering Ryugen is the merciful choice, where giving up prevents death, where your love for your wife somehow justifies handing millions of people to an empire that views them as resources to be extracted. He leaned forward slightly. But here's what I don't understand, Your Majesty. And I genuinely don't. I'm not being rhetorical. He let the words settle. How does surrender save anyone? The king's jaw tightened. The empire will what? Treat your people gently? Northern's voice was soft, almost curious. Integrate them peacefully into a system that views them as wayward provinces to be reclaimed? The Riemgard Empire isn't offering you partnership, Your Majesty. They're offering you terms of absorption. Your nobles become their vassals. Your resources become their resources. Your people become their taxpayers, their soldiers, their property. He picked up his cup and examined the wine inside without drinking. Dark liquid, dark thoughts. And your wife? What happens to her when you're no longer a king? When you're a defeated lord with no leverage, no territory, no value? He tilted the cup slightly, watching the wine catch the light. Do you think the empire will fund the search for her cure? Do you think they'll care? King Ruger's face had gone pale. You haven't thought that far, Northern said. It wasn't an accusation, just observation. Because you're not thinking strategically. You're thinking emotionally. You've decided that fighting means death, so surrendering must mean life. But that's not how empires work. That's not how conquest works. He set the cup down with a soft click. The people who die in a war of resistance, yes, they die. But they die with the possibility of victory. The people who are absorbed into an empire without resistance. He shook his head slowly. They die too, just slower. In mines, in fields, in conscript armies fighting someone else's wars. Their children grow up speaking someone else's language, worshipping someone else's stars, forgetting they were ever anything else. Northern's voice hardened. You're not choosing between death and survival, Your Majesty. You're choosing between a quick death with meaning and a slow death without any. Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. King Ruger's hands had curled into fists on the table. His breathing was uneven, shallow and ragged, the rhythm of a man fighting to hold himself together. You speak as though you understand. I understand that you love your wife, Northern interrupted, his voice gentler now. I understand that watching someone you love suffer is its own kind of torture. I understand that you'd burn the world to make it stop. His eyes met the king's directly and held it there. But I also understand that burning the world won't save her. And surrendering Ryugen won't either. The king looked away. Something wet glistened at the corner of his eye, quickly blinked away. Then what would you have me do? His voice was hoarse, scraped raw. Watch my people die in a war we cannot win? Watch my wife waste away while I play at being a king. Every day she grows weaker. Every day I sit in council chambers discussing tariffs while the woman I've loved for 30 years fades. He laughed. A bitter, broken sound. You don't know what it's like to be helpless, to have all the power of a kingdom and none of the power to save the one person who matters. Northern was quiet for a moment. He's not wrong. I don't know what it's like to watch someone I love die slowly while I'm powerless to stop it. But then again, I'm not powerless. Your Majesty, Northern said slowly. What exactly is wrong with your wife? King Ruger blinked at the shift in topic. It's a wasting disease. Her vitality drains day by day. The royal physicians have exhausted every treatment. Cavelin Citadel's finest healers have examined her. Nothing works. The source of the affliction remains unknown. That's why Roma was searching for the origin, trying to trace the stimulant that triggered it. Symptoms: fatigue that never lifts, muscle deterioration. Her soul essence is scattered, fragmented. The king's hands tightened on the edge of the table. as though something is slowly unraveling her from the inside. Northern's mind was already working. Soul essence scattered, fragmented, unraveling from the inside. Aoi! That sounds less like a disease and more like a curse, or a talent effect. Something that's actively working against her, not just natural deterioration. Target will need to be closely analyzed for a more correct analysis. If I'm able to copy her form or copy the sickness, is it possible to create a variation that will later breed a cure? Recursive generation works on probabilities. There's no way to know what the variant evolution will be until after they evolved. If the disease has a soul signature, it is possible to copy her form. You can also iterate her muscles. Your origin abilities can be used both on you and other people. Although the later bears upon you a great deal of burden. Northern was silent for a while. I see. But we'll need to see her. Correct. He fixed the king with a serious look. I want to examine her. King Ruger stared at him. I'm sorry. Your wife. I want to examine her. Tomorrow, if possible. Northern's voice was matter-of-fact, as though he were discussing the weather rather than inserting himself into the king's most private grief. I have certain abilities that might provide insight your healers lack. The king's expression shifted through several emotions. Hope, skepticism, suspicion, and something that looked painfully like fear of disappointment. Lord Northern, the finest healers in Ryugen have. I'm not a healer from Ryugen. Northern's smile was thin. I'm not a healer at all, really, but I can see things that healers can't. And if your wife's condition is what I suspect it might be. He let the implication hang. King Ruger studied him for a long moment. The candlelight cast deep shadows beneath his eyes, aging him another decade. Why? He asked finally. Why would you help her? This isn't altruism. You've been clear about wanting land, wanting strategic advantage. My wife's health is leverage, Northern finished. Yes, it is. He met the king's eyes without shame. If I can heal your wife, or at least identify what's killing her, then suddenly surrendering to the empire becomes less appealing, doesn't it? Suddenly you have something to fight for again. Suddenly my offer of alliance becomes significantly more attractive. The honesty seemed to catch the king off guard. You admit you're manipulating me. I'm negotiating with you, Northern corrected. Manipulation implies deception. I'm being completely transparent. I want land, though it's not entirely about the land itself. That's just to establish a foothold here. What I really want is to give the empire a run for their money. I want Ryugen to resist rather than fold. And if healing your wife achieves all of those goals while also keeping an innocent woman alive. He shrugged. I fail to see the downside. And if she's suffering from what I think she might be suffering from, then this isn't just about Ryugen anymore. King Ruger was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. Not hope, not yet, but the absence of hopelessness. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself. You're a strange young man, Lord Northern. I've been told. If you're lying to me, if you're offering false hope to secure an alliance, then you'll have every right to have me killed, Northern said pleasantly. But I'm not lying. I don't know if I can help your wife, but I do know that I can see things others can't. And right now, you have nothing to lose by letting me try. The king considered this. Around them, the banquet continued. Nasira had moved on to what appeared to be an entire roasted bird, attacking it with the kind of focus usually reserved for sworn enemies. Sale was having an increasingly animated conversation with a Ryugen noble about something that involved extensive hand gestures and what looked like barely contained excitement. Shay remained vigilant at her post, and Ellis had found wine, enough of it, apparently, to warrant a second glass. None of them seemed aware of the negotiation happening at the head of the table. Finally, King Ruger nodded. Tomorrow morning, I'll arrange for you to see her. Good. And the matter of land. We can discuss that after I've examined your wife, Northern said. Consider it a gesture of good faith. I'm not asking you to commit to anything tonight. Just keep an open mind. He picked up his chopsticks and resumed eating, signaling that the heavy part of the conversation was over. Besides, he added, almost as an afterthought, if I can heal her, my asking price goes up significantly. Best to establish a baseline now, don't you think? King Ruger stared at him. Then, despite everything, despite the grief and the exhaustion and the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, he laughed. It was small, fragile, but real. You're insufferable. Northern smiled. I'm not really. I'm just sort of desperate to prepare an amusing homecoming gift. The evening descended into night, and many continued to dine. But it wasn't long until Northern withdrew himself to the airship. As soon as Aisha saw him leave, she followed a few moments later. Sale was conscious enough to do the same, while everyone else either chatted with each other or drank. Ellis seemed to be having an extraordinarily generous amount of wine. Although Ryugen didn't produce strongly alcoholic drinks and banned the importation of some, their milder alcohols still depended on individual capacity. Moreover, as long as one was a drifter, it was permissible for them to drink, so everyone in the hall passed that threshold automatically. Northern leaned on the rim of the airship and was thinking. Of course, the real him was still in the Grand Archive, busy drinking in wells and wells of knowledge. The night in Ryugen was beautiful. The sky was dark, and the clouds were arranged as if the subtle flowing waves of an ocean at night had been captured and painted into the heavens. The moons were barely visible, but an edge of their circumference peeked through the clouds, making the mountains glow faintly. Northern could see the vastness of this section of the mountain from where he leaned. The lower rings were where other settlements sat. The middle rings too. Currently, they were in the upper ring, the segment where powerful nobles and the royal family resided. But Northern couldn't see most of it because he stood on the dock, which was like a cutout into the mountain itself. Structures of metallic platforms had been built here to hold the greatest of air vessels. It was actually quite impressive that the dock could hold Thunderhead Dreadnought so well. Northern imagined it crushing beneath the weight of the airship but immediately killed the thought. If Ryugen could build a dock like this, they had to have an airship comparable to Thunderhead Dreadnought. Maybe not in might, but certainly in size. How did your conversation with the king go? Northern was not surprised by the sound of his mother's voice. Her feet had been absolutely silent against the deck, but he'd already sensed her coming since the moment she left the hall and walked into the airship harbor. He smiled, receiving silver from her. The little girl was fast asleep, yet Northern cradled her in his arms with a delighted smile. My discussion with the king. He glanced at his mother, his expression dimming. He has a sick wife and wishes to not fight. Well, let's say, is considering not fighting. Aisha placed her hand over her mouth gently as it widened slightly in surprise. But Northern immediately smiled at her. Do not worry. I intend to take a look at her and find a cure for whatever is wrong with her. She looked at him with doubt. Really? How can you? Northern offered his mother a gentle smile that bordered on the edge of smug. I'm very talented, She raised a brow, looking at her son like he was some fraud. Northern exhaled. I can see in a way nobody else can. I'm sure you must know about me from Anike. Aisha's eyes changed slightly. Oh, well yes, she did. But does it work with that? This is a medical condition. Northern looked at his mother keenly. It's simply analysis. My eyes can analyze anything, and I have a unique part of me that has the ability to copy whatever I analyze. My suspicion is that the king's wife has some sort of soul essence deficiency affecting her soul. I should be able to deal with it if that's what it is. Aisha folded her arms over her chest and looked at him sternly. And if it's not? Northern paused for a moment. He was actually silent. I haven't exactly considered that. There were very few times where Northern had been wrong, especially since becoming a demon. He smiled a little and looked at his mother. I'm quite confident, Mother. Aisha shrugged. I know you are, but if there's one thing I know, it's the austere manner in which life operates. It's no friend of anyone and not exactly anyone's enemy either. You should prepare for failure with the same effort and expectations you used to prepare for success. Northern was silent. He wanted to think that his mom wouldn't understand. But then, probably wasn't about this case specifically. Recently, he had been overconfident. And of course, that was because he was now strong enough to back up the weight of his words. But Aisha's words were as precious as his current state of being. He was going to treasure them. He looked at his mother seriously. "What do you suggest I do then, mother?" Aisha looked down, silent for a few moments. Her gaze locked downward as she dove into a river of thoughts behind her eyes. Then she turned to Northern. "How about I just join you? I spent almost 50 years in Stuart tending to plants and flowers. I'm sure there'll be something for her when I see her symptoms. So how about I just follow you?" "Ah, right." For a moment, Northern had almost forgotten that Aisha used to work with a lot of herbs, and then he and Shin would collect more for her anytime they went hunting. She even had a small flower garden behind the house. So it was all from her time as an elf. Northern was still smiling at Aisha, making her raise a suspicious brow at him. "What?" Northern chuckled. "I'll talk to the king about it first and get back to you." "All right then." Aisha said it, but still fixed Northern with a stern glare. "I know that's not what that was about. What is going on in your head?" Northern was silent for a moment. Then he said to his mother, silver still cradled in his hands, "I've just been wondering recently. You're an elf. How do you look?" Aisha looked at him first, then she suddenly started laughing. Northern was slightly confused as he watched his mother crack up. One hell of a laugh, the kind that came from deep in the chest. She calmed down gently, sweeping a tear from the corner of her right eye with a finger. Northern was still looking at her, tempted to ask what was so funny, but it would have undoubtedly come out with a tone that would make his mother knock the sense back into his head. So he just watched Aisha with a subtle mix that tilted more towards confusion than the amusement of, "I made mother laugh." "Interesting." Aisha set her gaze on him fondly. "My elf form, there's nothing different about it." She smiled at whatever expression he was making. "Indeed, elves can alter their shape and form as they wish when we want to wear a human guise. But we can also decide to still keep our elven features." "Oh." Northern understood now. The reason for her laughter. She must have found him particularly cute when he asked that question. Suddenly he was feeling awkward, like a child who'd asked something obvious and only realized it after the words left his mouth. "I can still show you." Aisha smiled and waved her hand slightly. As she did, her body morphed, but only slightly. Her bright amber eyes were still bright amber and her blonde hair was still blonde. Her ears were pointed outward and sharp at their edges, and she looked slightly taller, almost as tall as Northern himself. She looked mostly the same both as elf and human, but Northern considered her elven form more elegant and beautiful for some unknown reason. Something about the way her features sharpened, perhaps. The way she seemed to belong to something older than the world he knew. Aisha tilted her head. "Satisfied?" Northern smiled. "Yes, mother." She nodded and reverted to her human form. "Ah, right." Northern remembered something crucial and looked at his mother. "I caught a guy that had invaded the Therian Citadel. He's from Stuart. Perhaps we could interrogate him together." Aisha's face turned serious immediately. "Really? Of course we can." Her eyes sharpened with interest. "I've been wanting to know what that old man has been up to, after all." Northern turned, gesturing for his mother to follow, which she did. He said as they walked, "I've been curious, mother. Do you know about the Dark Elves? I hear they're extinct, but I think Ruffsburg and Kahl had something to do with them." The sound of Ruffsburg's name made Aisha's face twist with barely contained anger. The man, after all, was the reason why her baby boy had suffered so much. The day was still like yesterday before her eyes, when she thought Northern was simply going to the academy. What harm could it do? And all of a sudden, she could not hear from her son anymore. If not for that evil man, she stubbornly believed she and Shin would have been able to build a perfect life for him. One where he wouldn't be involved in all the cruelties of the world and have to suffer one bit. She reined in her anger and hostility to answer her son's question. "Dark elves were just a folktale even by the time I was born. The elven kingdom used to be much larger, much grander." She paused, gathering old memories. And in those times, the dark elves and light elves lived together. The stories didn't exactly describe it as harmony, but we at least coexisted. I just think there were conflicts from time to time. They walked along the stairs, shoes clinking on metal steps. What could have caused the division was the deterioration of the elven land. We all were in a world of our own until some really powerful people in the underworld decided that they owned the land. Aisha's voice carried an edge of old bitterness. They pursued us out of our own home after a war that wiped the majority of us out. Stuart was a little town that took us in and later flourished. Her voice sounded softer now. The Dark Ones, they were not content with staying small like we were. So they kept fighting. So the book said. Fighting for land, losing themselves until nothing of them was left. They finally reached a hall, a much lower floor than the one Shin was on. I see, Northern said. He was thinking about Aster, who was groomed for simply one reason, to go back to Stuart and take back what was theirs. He and whoever that instructor was greatly believed they could reclaim Stuart. Either they were delusional beyond what delusion often connoted, or they had something Northern wasn't seeing. Not to mention there were elves from Stuart on trial too. He had several questions the more he thought about it. Questions such as, how did the elves from Stuart always manage to come to trial, or better put, the lesser fragment, but find it harder to return to Stuart? The method had to be incredibly difficult. So much so that the Dark Elves had to form an alliance with Khal and silently plan for hundreds of years. There have to be others. Aster was still alive. Northern was going to send a clone to Drywall and bring Aster to Ryugen after he was done with the Grand Archive. For now, Northern finally stopped in front of a black metal door and opened it. He and Aisha entered a simple room. It had elegant interior decor, but when brought into close contrast with Shin's room, it lacked greatly in elegance and seemed average. There were simply chairs, beds, a plain dark-colored carpet with crude yet somewhat amusing designs. The walls were darkened and the entire atmosphere of the room carried that same muted quality. 2 beds were positioned opposite each other, with a center table and chairs between them. Spacious enough for both dwellers not to have to worry about getting in each other's way. As Northern and his mother entered, Alistran and the elf quickly sat up. The man looked at Northern, obviously pissed, but somehow hiding it behind a smile. Stars, Rian. Is that how it is now? Because of your suspicions of me, you throw me around like a criminal? He spread his hands in mock hurt. This sort of hurts, you know? Northern fixed the man with a cold glare and shrugged. You brought this upon yourself. All I ask for is honesty, and yet... He let the pause stretch. Somehow you keep playing me. He grabbed a chair and offered it to his mother. Waited until she sat down before finding one for himself. Then he looked at both of them and said simply, well, let's start all over again. Okay? Who are you guys? And why were you after my mother? Northern and Aisha sat between the 2 beds while Alistran stood near the door. The elven man occupied his own bed, watching everything unfold with a dark expression. Silence hung in the room for a long moment. Northern observed both of them, the tension in Alistran's shoulders, the careful stillness of the elf, then spoke. So, care to speak after lying to my face? Alistran sighed and sat down on his bed, heaving tiredly. Look, boy, I have told you all that you needed to know. How come we're still here? Not to even speak of the bond that you and I share. He shook his head. To be honest, I'm just shocked you could treat me like this. Northern chuckled and folded his arms. You know what I find oddly disturbing, Alistran? Alistran raised his head and looked at Northern. It's how you're oddly always in the scene where my mother got kidnapped. The last time you took us right into the place. I suppose you never could have thought that I would somehow have been able to find her all of a sudden. Without even looking at all. Northern let that hang for a moment. You must have underestimated my eyes a great deal. He shrugged. Okay, maybe you didn't even underestimate me because I couldn't see what was right in front of me then. But still, it must have hurt you to lose her when she was so close. Northern's eyes grew cold. The kind of cold that made the air feel heavier. You underestimated me then. And you're making that same mistake now. He paused, letting that sink in. You still don't know how much I can see, do you? You just keep underestimating my eyes. Alistran was looking straight at Northern, confusion plain in his gaze. The things Northern was saying felt wrong to him, accusations that didn't fit. A stern frown darkened his face. Listen, boy, I will not let you continue to disrespect me on no grounds. Do we do this by force, or do you let me out of here? Northern looked at the man with something approaching disbelief. Oh, you're sure? You want to go that route? Are you sure? Alistran paused. His face betrayed him for a moment, showing signs of internal conflict. He pressed his lips together and exhaled, schooling his expression before meeting Northern's gaze again. Why don't you just wait till Thalen comes around? I'm sure he'll be able to clear the air. Northern shook his head. Thalen is your anchor point because that must have been the first person you got to. You're hardly ever at the scene, Alistran. You're always somewhere in the background, doing something. Why is that, I wonder? The secrets of the guild are handled by me. Thalen trusts me to the very crust of Trael. We're sworn brothers. Alistran's voice grew harder. The fact that you are holding me here, insisting that I am someone I am not, will make him really angry. You might lose your ties to the Therian Citadel. Northern's expression went blank. Forget losing Therian Citadel. I will raze down the whole of Drywall if I find out that others were involved in those sinful atrocities of yours. His voice dropped. So, if you do truly care about the headmaster and his people, you better start talking. Alistran sighed and lowered his head, genuinely exhausted by how this was going. Northern just sat there confidently, watching him. Aisha had been silent for several minutes. When the atmosphere grew quiet again, she finally exhaled and smiled, looking at Northern first. At first, witnessing you talk to him, I was convinced he really might not have anything to do with the kidnappings. Not to speak of the fact that I had never even seen his face before. Alistran glanced up, hope flickering across his features. But Aisha was not done. That was until you offered your last statement. She turned her gaze to him fully. Did my son ever openly accuse you of being someone else? She shook her head. No, he didn't. A small smile curved her lips. All he accused you of is why you're after me, yet you just slipped under duress. You must have gone through intense sessions like this before, sessions where your identity is always suspected. Mr. Alistran. Alistran froze. He rubbed his face with his hands, rubbed his eyes, the exhaustion no longer just physical. Northern stayed silent, his face carefully blank, but something warm flickered in his chest. Nice catch, Mom. Alistran looked truly confused now, seeming to be sorting through his own thoughts and the accusations swirling around him. Something in Aisha's expression changed. She raised her chin, a dangerous light entering her eyes. It must be really haunting you wherever you are, being right in front of me like this, yet unable to do anything about it. Her voice went soft, almost gentle. Peacemaker. Alistran stared at Aisha with pure disbelief. He laughed first, a sharp, startled sound, then looked at both of them with a deepening frown. Peacemaker. He turned to Northern. Really? You think I'm Peacemaker? You think I'm an elf? He gestured to his own body. Look at me thoroughly, boy. I am human. Very, very human. I have a human background, I have a human livelihood, I have a wife and a daughter, for all the stars. What are you even saying? Northern didn't look at Alistran anymore. He simply shifted his attention to the elven man who had remained silent this entire time, studying him with keen interest. Elven 1, what do you have to say about this? Were you really coming from South Drywall as this man, who is so convinced that he is who he is, has said? Northern tilted his head. Or were you with this peacemaker person when he suddenly shed his skin? The elf tried to hide it, but he was trembling in his eyes, that subtle thing, when fear overtakes the body's control. It was hard to keep the muscles of his face still. Northern saw it and preyed on it. The elf's silence was damning. Northern rose from his position between the beds and handed silver to his mother before turning to face the elf fully. His movements were unhurried, almost casual. The temperature in the room didn't change. Not yet. But something else did. Something in the air itself. The elf felt it first. A crawling sensation at the base of his spine, like cold fingers walking up his vertebrae. His breathing quickened involuntarily. "You're using dread manifestation. You know," Northern said conversationally, walking toward the elf's bed. "I find elves fascinating. Your kind lives so long. Centuries, sometimes. All that time to accumulate experiences, memories, fears." He stopped at the foot of the bed, looking down at the trembling man. "But that longevity comes with a cost, doesn't it? You've had so much more time to learn what pain feels like." The elf's hands gripped his knees, knuckles whitening. I don't know anything. We were coming from South Drywall. I swear on the stars." Northern tilted his head slightly. "Ah, see, that's the problem. An invisible thread, thinner than spider silk and completely imperceptible, pierced through the air and anchored itself to the elf's soul. You're using soul string." The sensation that flooded back to Northern was informative. Terror, yes, that was expected. But beneath it, something more interesting. Confusion, guilt, layered, heavy guilt, and recognition. This elf knew exactly who Peacemaker was. Northern smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You're lying." "I'm not. Your soul disagrees with your mouth." Northern's eyes flickered with blue demonic light, seeing through flesh and bone to the truth beneath. "Your heart rate just spiked. Your essence is contracting defensively. And there's this weight in your chest." He paused. "Confusion? Were you surprised yourself, the first time you saw him become a different person? Absolutely convinced of who he is?" The elf's face drained of color. Northern pulled a chair from the corner of the room and set it down directly in front of the elf, sitting with casual ease. Their knees were almost touching. "Let me explain how this is going to work," he said, his voice calm, almost friendly. "I'm going to ask you questions. You're going to answer them. And every time you lie to me—" He raised one finger. A single arc of lightning crackled between his thumb and forefinger. Bright blue, beautiful, and absolutely controlled. "You're using lightning rod. I'm going to remind you why honesty is important." The elf flinched backward, pressing himself against the headboard. Please, you don't understand. If I talk, they'll what?" Northern leaned forward slightly. "Kill you? Torture you?" He let out a soft laugh. "Friend, you're looking at the wrong timeline. They are a future problem." The lightning flickered between his fingers. "I am a present certainty." The light grew brighter. "So, let's start simple." Northern's voice dropped, losing all pretense of friendliness. "The man sitting on that bed, is he a Lystran of Therian Citadel? Or is he wearing a Lystran like a costume?" The elf's eyes darted to a Lystran, to the man claiming to be a Lystran, and in that single glance, Northern saw everything he needed. But he wanted to hear it. I. Wrong answer." Northern didn't even move his hand. The lightning simply jumped. A thin, precise arc that struck the elf's shoulder. Not enough to cause real damage. Just enough to make every nerve ending in his arm scream in unison. The elf gasped, a strangled sound of pure agony, his body convulsing once before going rigid. "That was setting 1, Northern said calmly. "There are 10. By setting 5, you'll lose bladder control. By setting 7, you'll start forgetting words. By setting 10, he shrugged. "Well, actually, I've never tried this on anyone, so I don't even know what will happen by then. Who knows? My predictions for 5 and 7 might be wrong too." Aisha watched from her position, her expression unreadable. She had seen glimpses of Northern's capabilities before, knew the devastation he was capable of. But this cold, methodical precision was different, far beyond anything she'd ever thought or expected. This was her son as interrogator. She found she didn't look away. The elf was crying now, tears streaming down his face as the residual electricity made his muscles twitch involuntarily. He's. The elf's voice was barely a whisper. Louder, Northern said. For the room. He is a Lystran, but he's also the peacemaker. Northern raised his chin, smirking slightly. Is that so? A cold light glowed in his eyes. Continue. For the past 50 years, all of us have been on Trael, searching for the princess. The elf glanced at Aisha, doing everything to avoid meeting her gaze. A Lystran was someone that Lord Peacemaker took the skin of and became in order to find her. Our search led us to Thalen and his established citadel. We integrated it. He swallowed hard, the words coming faster now. Soon Lord Peacemaker gained the trust of Thalen and used his network to fund and carry out undercover searches. A couple months ago, we finally found a list of search complaints submitted to the Citadel. During that period, there were a lot of complaints, people requesting to pay huge amounts of money for Citadels to go and bring their children back from the academy. His head stayed lowered. The names stood out differently, and I spoke to Lord Peacemaker about it. His tone slowed, weighted with something like fear. Lord Peacemaker, not a Lystran. Northern furrowed his brows. Are you saying that they're the same person, and at the same time they're not? Aisha exhaled at the same moment the elf nodded. A Lystran, though, only looked more confused and lost. Frantically, almost unbelievably looking between the elf and Northern, his mouth hanging open. He was sincere, very sure that this was all nonsense they were talking about. He genuinely doesn't know, Northern realized. That's either the greatest act I've ever seen or, if he was another person, why would he ever lie about it? Peacemaker is a master of skin, Aisha said quietly. It's an art he has learned to live. He was originally a crafter, before he became known as Peacemaker. She paused, something complicated passing through her expression. He truly might be capable of convincing himself that he is someone else. He is that scary of a man. But one thing I know, he is not reckless. She looked into the elf's eyes. He has a code. There's something. How do you communicate with him? The elf looked at a Lystran. A Lystran looked back at him with a dark frown. You bastard. His voice shook with anger. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to put me in trouble to explain yourself away and escape. Right? He glanced at Northern. Rian. To think you'd actually believe this guy over me. Northern was silent for a moment. Then he sighed and shook his head. It's quite pitiful, actually. The life you thought you had built for yourself, the person you consider yourself to be. Everything was merely an illusion. A Lystran stared at Northern with a small frown. Like Northern was saying something absolutely nonsensical, and he was purely going to go crazy from how absurd it was. He managed to calm himself down the next second, though. Listen, boy. But Northern had already stopped paying attention to him. Instead, he was looking at the elf. How do we bring this peacemaker out? The elf hesitated. Northern looked at him coldly. The lightning sparked, appearing out of thin air like a luminous thread. Have you forgotten your situation here? The elf lowered his head, as if in physical pain from what he was about to say. He has to go unconscious. Unconscious? Northern asked, strangely amused. The elf nodded. I see. That's oddly peculiar. He turned to a Lystran, balling his fist. Oh well, if it's just getting you unconscious, that'll be surprisingly easy. A Lystran looked at Northern's fist and laughed shortly. Are you serious right now? You, the one who stood your ground against Lieutenant Dante. You want to punch me to get me unconscious? He shook his head. I don't think I'll ever wake up. The words triggered something in Aisha's memory, the rift in Arcadia, and vaguely the things that had happened there. That was also the place where Byran had come to be, and where Northern might have made major contact with the Chaos Prince's soul, aside from the vestige that he took. He's stronger than he lets on, she thought. Even now. Northern looked at a Lystran and offered the most harmless smile in the world while pulling back his fist. Well, let's find out. A Lystran's gaze darkened. You'd be foolish to think I'd just. His vision didn't even catch a glimpse of Northern's hand. All he felt was the pain of something that seemed carved from an iron mountain slamming into his stomach. Wind exploded from his back. He would have flown from the impact, but Northern immediately killed the momentum by holding him in place against the force. The room shuddered slightly. Alistran's pupils vanished. His knees slowly hit the ground, and he fainted. Silence drenched the room the moment Alistran collapsed. Aisha looked at the scenery, her face a mixture of shock and awe. It was almost like she found this version of events to be particularly impressive. She looked at the unconscious Alistran with a small frown, however, and turned to Northern. "Lael, we should take Silver away from here." Northern looked back at his mother. "Ah, right." Another clone appeared next to him and gently collected the little girl from her mother. Meanwhile, Aisha had to consciously control herself, adjusting to the atmosphere of her son's many talents. She certainly knew that this particular ability was her husband's own. As the other clone carried the child away, she looked at Northern and curiously asked, "How many is your limit right now?" Northern glanced back, watching his clone's retreating form, and immediately realized what his mother was asking. "Oh, limitless actually. There's no limit." Aisha's mouth fell open. "So you have many? How many do you have right now?" "About 32? Minus the original." Aisha brought her hand to her mouth in shock. "So, this one now, are you real?" Northern smiled at the look on his mother's face, then looked away, thinking for a bit. By this time Alistran stirred on the floor. Something was changing about the man, but Northern was more fixated on answering his mother's question. "Personally, I believe all my clones are as real as my original body is. I can shift my main consciousness across any one of them while replacing my supposed original body with that of the clone. So everyone is as real as I am." He paused. "But to put it simply, my original body never left the Grand Archive." He looked at his mother. "The kingdom's library." The elf looked discombobulated, her gaze darting between the rising Alistran, who was morphing as he got up, and the mother and son duo casually having a conversation. Aisha smiled sweetly at Northern's response, especially the last part. "The library, we did try to make you hate books. I'm of the opinion that everything wrong about this world started with books." Shin, of course, didn't fully agree with me, but he was the one who also believed teaching you the martial art he'd learned was going to be a curse for you to bear. Northern sighed. "What do I do with you both?" Aisha looked down, somber. "Anik told us so much, and it made us feel so much fear. Hence." Alistran, no peacemaker, was fully standing now. He was a dangerously beautiful elven man with bone-white skin and hair like wild frost, swept back and spiked in untamed waves. His ears rose to sharp points, almost blade-like in their severity. But it was his eyes that held one captive. Brilliant emerald green, glowing with an unsettling intensity beneath a perpetual scowl. "Orisha!" The words crawled out of his mouth like metal scraping against concrete. Northern smiled gently and placed his hands on his mother's shoulders. "I've had enough time to hate everyone, and blame a lot of people. I'm a better person now, stronger too. Of course, it doesn't invalidate the sufferings I had to experience, but what was the guarantee that my life would have turned out any different even if you had taught me all those things?" Northern breathed gently. "I guess I just don't want to keep blaming people or pointing fingers. Anik, you, Shin, Raven. Everyone who thought they could orchestrate my life for my own good." He looked away wistfully. "Orisha, how dare you? My life strangely is filled with people like these." Northern let the thought settle, familiar and well-worn by now. "I don't particularly resent them, nor do I feel any sort of gratitude. I'm just indifferent, I think." He smirked. "But at least the tables have turned." "Orisha!" The cool, handsome man yelled and yanked his hand forward. But in that instant, Northern's and Aisha's eyes sharpened to slits. Northern's eyes glowed blue while Aisha's radiated amber light. The stare alone made the elven man's hand freeze mid-air, and he trembled back, his face pale and eyes wide. He was so shaken to the core that he had to ask himself internally, What happened to me? Did I just fear?" It was true. Peacemaker, a high nobility of the Light Elves from Stuart, a person belonging to the royal circle of the court, respected and feared by many, a selector of kings, felt fear for the first time in his life. He clenched his fist and his frown deepened. He focused on Aisha first. Orisha, such a thuggish expression belongs not to your delicate face. Wipe that off. He spoke casually with a gentle hand dismissal. Then he turned to Northern. You. Something is not right about you. I have never sensed any human like you. Care to explain who you are? Northern was silent, looking at the man from his feet to his head with mild irritation. I see it has not settled in. Northern didn't move. He simply looked at Peacemaker, really looked at him, and along with the cold glow of his eyes, something shifted in the air. The elven man's next words died in his throat. Not from fear this time, from something he couldn't quite recognize anymore. It felt like he was losing grasp on something and couldn't even identify what it was. It was as if someone had reached inside his chest and turned off a light he'd never realized was always burning. Slowly, he began to realize. The connection to his essence, the flow of power he'd wielded for centuries, was gone, silent, like a river suddenly running dry. Peacemaker's emerald eyes widened. His hands moved instinctively, trying to conjure anything. A simple light ward, a basic enhancement, but there was nothing there. Nothing answered. What? He breathed, and for the first time his voice cracked. Northern tilted his head slightly, and the shadows in the room seemed to lean toward him. Not dramatically, subtly, as if they were listening. And then the fear came. Not the rational caution from before. This was something older. Something that bypassed the mind entirely and spoke directly to the marrow. Peacemaker's legs trembled. His perfect posture crumbled. Cold sweat beaded on that bone-white skin. I didn't seal your voice, Northern said softly, almost kindly. You asked who I am. You can still ask. Though I suspect the question has changed. Peacemaker's knees buckled. The selector of kings, the high nobility of Stuart, knelt on the floor. Not by choice, but because his body simply refused to stand in the presence of whatever was looking at him through those glowing blue eyes. Aisha watched with an expression caught between maternal pride and something approaching awe. Northern hadn't raised a hand, had barely even moved. He'd simply decided that Peacemaker was no longer permitted to be powerful. And reality had agreed. Peacemaker had never felt in his entire life the way he felt right now. There were no words to explain it. He had never truly believed in the existence of invincible supremacy. He had never actually accepted the fact that even the Origins who sat at the top of the food chain were untouchable. Not really. Not in a way that mattered. He had encountered few of them in his lifetime, and although their strength was legendary, Peacemaker had never felt fear like this. Not as he stood before someone who appeared, in all visible manner, to be an ordinary person. Something was definitely wrong. There was something he wasn't considering, something he was missing, and the uncertainty terrified him more than the sensation itself. An origin. He's an origin. At the same time, it couldn't be. It was impossible for an origin to pass the threshold between the greater fragment and the lesser fragment. What was going on? What was he missing? It was also impossible for an origin to strip him of his identity by merely looking. Right now, it felt like the world was not allowing him to exist on his own. As if the very fabric of reality had decided he was no longer welcome in it. He felt like he had crossed a king, and the world of that king had damned him in return. His shoulders trembled. He slowly looked up at Northern, and by the time he did, his handsome face from before carried a different persona. Broken, despondent, terrified. He tried to speak, but the old man's mouth only trembled. He was suddenly looking older than he had appeared just seconds ago, centuries of life weighing visibly on features that had seemed ageless moments before. The other elf, the one sitting on his bed, wishing he didn't exist in this present scenario, stayed as still as he had been. In fact, it was almost easy to forget he was in the room at all. That was how hard he worked not to be. Aisha was shocked, her eyes filled with genuine surprise. Something that bordered on twisted glee, in fact. Never in her life would she have thought it possible for Peacemaker himself to be in this position. The man was on his knees, trembling, groveling before her, particularly before her son. It was both amazing and terrifying to watch. It satisfied her, but it also made her wary of just how powerful her son had become. Not in a bad manner, of course, but wary nonetheless. Peacemaker is one of the 5 strongest people in Stuart, and yet, She stole a glance at her son. Northern was probably the one most unaffected by this entire scenario. He looked bored, in fact, as if this was just another troublesome day for him. The attitude this one had developed after defeating the alleged undefeatable was, certainly odd, but amusing nonetheless. Northern looked at Peacemaker, who was shaking on his knees. What coup? Could he be? Is he, my chest? My lungs? I can't feel my breath. The man's mind was in disaster. Northern watched him in silent amusement. Peacemaker, is it? He paused, letting his natural hoarse voice settle into the room, almost echoing off the walls. Do you want your essence back? The trembling Peacemaker froze, and slowly his head rose. Sir? See, can I? A corner of Northern's lips curled up. Listen. He placed his hand on the man's white hair. Oh, it's silky. Curiosity has been killing me for a while about what it feels like. The hair was silky to the touch, but that was beside the point. The scene radiated too much dominion for anyone to guess that Northern harbored a childlike curiosity about an elf's hair. From the outside, it looked like a conqueror placing his hand upon the head of a defeated king. Are you ready to enslave yourself to me? Peacemaker trembled. He was looking at Northern, really looking, his eyes shaking as he considered what it meant to be a slave. First, he thought to himself, all that matters is that I take it back. Then I can anticipate better this time. But Peacemaker was a wise and experienced man. He knew how to spot the flaw in his own thinking. Someone who calmly took it before could calmly take it again. In that moment, he simply came to truly understand that the white-haired boy with blue eyes standing above him, holding his head, was beyond him. He was lesser, and this strange human was greater. Then the answer came. Yes, I will be enslaved, as long as I can have my power back. Northern sighed and nodded his head. Okay. Just like that, Peacemaker felt himself again. His essence flowed through his body, warm and familiar. He felt accepted by the world once more and felt truly powerful again. So powerful, in fact, that it was almost easy to forget that the one greater than him stood right in front of him. He furrowed his brow and lifted one foot to stand, but then suddenly stopped midway. His eyes met Northern's, and he reminded himself of what had happened seconds ago. He lowered the leg and bowed his head. Master, what do you need? Aisha chuckled faintly, staring in disbelief. What? To her, this was almost like a dream come true. Northern smiled. Actually, the one who'll be your master isn't really me. He gestured to Aisha, who was sitting next to him. It's my mother. At that moment, Aisha crossed one leg over the other, sat straight, and flicked her hair with pride. Peacemaker slowly turned to her, his mouth gradually falling open. His face contorted in rage, and he glared at Northern. Human, do not take my submission for foolishness. Northern sighed. Then he stood up and drove his foot into the man's face with a motion so fast that even the air didn't anticipate it. Peacemaker's head flew back and smashed into the metal wall of the room, bending it inward. Blood was already streaming from his nose. Folding his arms and looking at the elven man with disdain, Northern slowly lowered his foot. Speak to me with respect. To my mother, double it. Peacemaker slowly pulled his face free from the indentation and saw that it had been disfigured by a single kick. Blood now stained his handsome, ancient face. He raised his hand and wiped a little of the blood away, just to confirm he was actually bleeding. And indeed, he was bleeding. The blood dripped from his fingers, each drop hitting the floor with a sound that seemed to echo in the silence. Peacemaker stared at the crimson stain on his pale hand as though he were seeing something impossible. He was bleeding. Him. The man who had walked through battlefields unscathed. The man who had faced transcendence and walked away without a scratch. The man whose very essence commanded respect from the elements themselves. Bleeding from a kick. A single, casual kick from a human who looked no older than 20 winters. His mind, which had been a hurricane of thoughts just moments ago, suddenly went still, clear. A cold, terrible understanding settled into his bones. This isn't strength. This isn't power. This is something else entirely. Something I've never encountered in 9 centuries of existence. It has to be. Peacemaker slowly lowered his bloodied hand. The rage that had flared in his chest guttered and died, replaced by something far more primal. Survival instinct. Pure and undeniable. He had lived for over 900 years by knowing when to bend and when to break. Right now, every fiber of his being screamed that breaking was the only option on the table. Pride was a luxury for those who could afford it. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, this time keeping his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. I apologize for my disrespect. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he forced them out nonetheless. Northern said nothing. He simply stood there, arms folded, waiting. Peacemaker understood. An apology wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Slowly, painfully, the ancient elf turned to face Aisha, the woman who, in his memory, had been nothing more than a troublesome princess, a project. The woman whom he had tormented over the years for his own amusement. The woman whose son now held his very existence in the palm of his hand. Lady Orisha. It's Lady Aisha, you fat bone. Forgive me, Lady Aisha. Each word felt like swallowing broken glass. I humbly submit myself to your service. Aisha's expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. Not kind, not cruel, but something in between. The smile of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. Peacemaker, she said, tasting his name like a fine wine. Do you remember what you said to me 217 years ago at my coming-of-age ceremony? The elf's face paled further, an impressive feat given his current blood loss. Lady Aisha, you said, she continued, as if he hadn't said anything at all. My ego, my confidence, my courage, and my heroic complex, and I would be forced to bear his child. Her voice was even almost conversational. You said so, but you know me, you know I'm too clever, so I'll spend each day hating the child and trying not to kill it. You said you would stop me at all costs. And when I'm done, you'll sow your seed in me, as well as your 3 other sons. Aisha's eyes gleamed with something dark and satisfied. It's been 217 years, Peacemaker, and I've never forgotten a single word of what you whispered into my ear that day to break me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Northern's eyebrow rose slightly. He looked at his mother, then back at Peacemaker, and something cold flickered behind those blue eyes. Something that made the temperature feel like it had dropped several degrees. I didn't know that, Northern said quietly. Peacemaker felt the temperature in the room drop. Not metaphorically, actually physically drop. Frost began to crystallize on the metal walls. His breath came out in visible puffs, curling white in the suddenly frigid air. Frost? He realized with mounting horror. How can he control Frost again? How? Wait. Who? The pieces clicked together in his mind, and somehow that understanding only made it worse. Northern. Aisha's voice cut through the building pressure like a blade. It's fine. It's not fine. It is. Because now. She leaned forward, and her smile widened. Now, Peacemaker is going to spend however long I deem necessary making up for every single word. Every single slight. Every single thing he uttered in hopes of breaking my spirit, but only ended up fueling my resolve. She stood up from the chair and walked toward the kneeling elf, her footsteps measured and deliberate. Each step echoed in the frost-touched silence. You're going to give me the names of every noble in the Cabal, every perpetrator of the heinous acts you commit on their behalf. You will reveal all the resources you have planted around Trael. She stopped, letting the weight of her next words settle. And today is the end of your dream of bringing back that man. She stopped directly in front of him and tilted his chin up with one finger, forcing him to meet her eyes. Her gaze was unyielding, absolute. And then, Peacemaker, you're going to help me burn Stuart down. For a moment, something flickered in Peacemaker's ancient eyes. Defiance, perhaps, or pride. The last vestiges of who he had been. 900 years of accumulated power and influence reduced to this. Then he remembered the feeling of being unnamed, of being nothing, of being less than the dust beneath this human's feet. Yes, he whispered. As you command, my lady. Aisha held his gaze for a long moment, searching for deception, for hidden resistance. Finding none, she released his chin and stepped back. Good. We'll begin soon. For now, heal yourself and stay in this room. If you try to leave, if you try to contact anyone, if you even think about betraying us. She glanced at Northern. My son will know. And what he did to you just now. That was mercy. Trust me when I say you don't want to see what he considers punishment. Northern, who had been watching the exchange with quiet interest, finally spoke. One more thing. Peacemaker looked up, bracing himself. The elf on the bed. Northern gestured vaguely toward Millis, who had been doing an exceptional job of becoming one with the furniture throughout this entire exchange. What's his relation to you? Peacemaker's jaw tightened. He's my son. Millis. The son who was supposed to... Oh! There was a heavy pause in the air. The frost on the walls seemed to thicken. Then, yes. Northern hummed thoughtfully, the sound deceptively casual. Then he turned his attention to Millis, who looked like he wanted the bed to swallow him whole. You. Stand up. Millis stood so fast he nearly fell over himself. His legs were visibly shaking, barely keeping him upright. I wasn't part of it, he blurted out. I just followed orders, I didn't. Did you help? Millis's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The silence was answer enough. Northern sighed, running a hand through his white hair. You know, I'm really trying to be patient today. It's not my strong suit, but I'm trying. He walked toward Millis, and with each step, the elf seemed to shrink further into himself. By the time Northern stopped in front of him, Millis looked like he was trying to fold himself out of existence. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to serve my mother too. Not because you deserve mercy, you don't, but because she might find you useful. If she decides you're not useful, I'll let her decide what happens to you. Understood? Why, yes. Yes, I understand. Thank you. Thank you for your mercy. Northern's expression flickered with something that might have been disgust. Or maybe just exhaustion. Don't thank me. Thank the fact that my mother is here. It'd have been very satisfying to make you experience your ahem. Anyways. He cut himself off, jaw tightening briefly. Thank my mother. He turned back to Aisha, his expression softening slightly. The cold edge in his eyes receded, replaced by something warmer, more human. Mother, I'll be outside. Take whatever time you need with them. If they cause any trouble. I know. Aisha smiled. I'll call for you. Northern nodded and walked toward the door. But just before he reached it, he paused and looked back at Peacemaker. The frost had begun to recede from the walls, but the chill in his gaze remained. By the way, your name, Peacemaker. It's a good name. Strong. Meaningful. His eyes glinted with something between amusement and threat. Would be a shame if someone took it permanently, wouldn't it? He didn't wait for an answer. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow echoed like a thunderclap in the silence. In the wake of his departure, Peacemaker remained on his knees, blood still dripping from his face, staring at the closed door. The frost was melting now, leaving wet trails down the metal walls like the room itself was weeping. 900 years. 900 years of building power, influence, and fear, and it had taken less than an hour for all of it to crumble. This is my life now, he realized, the thought settling into him like ice into his bones. However long it lasts. The night was beautiful. Ellis, along with the other students, came stumbling onto the airship where Knight Chrysler and Olland waited to look after them. Laughter spilled across the deck, punctuated by the occasional wobble and catch. Perhaps it was for his sins, or perhaps some lingering attachment to the academy, even though nothing remained of it now but ruins. Olland hung around the students and watched over them like he was their butler. He steadied them when they swayed, directed them toward railings when they wandered too close to edges, all with the patient resignation of someone who'd long since stopped expecting dignity from the young. All of them were drunk, both on wine and happiness, and Northern just leaned against the rim and watched them make fools of themselves. Watching them did grace his lips with a smile. Here, in this moment, he found the gentility of life in a manner he never used to. It was strange how something so simple, watching people stumble and laugh and be utterly careless, could feel like a gift. Then he spotted Judgment, who seemed locked in an intensely serious discussion with Nasira, face flushed and eyes burning with passion. Should I be worried for Nissa? He decided not to think about it too hard. After all of them had swooped in like a bunch of drunkards, gracing the deck with a little bit of drama before the adults managed to usher them into their rooms, silence fell on the airship once again. And in that silence, Sale came to Northern. He stood beside him without saying anything, just looking into the night sky, coated with a dark blue hue and a million white dots. The wind carried the faint smell of altitude, thin and cold. Sale did glance at Northern a lot, thinking he was rather smooth with it. He wasn't. Only for Northern to say moments later, I can do a lot of things for sure, but reading minds isn't one of them. Sale belatedly looked at him, chuckling with the subtle shame of someone caught trying to be clever. Aha! Indeed, Lord Northern. If you had been capable of such, I don't know, you might as well have been an Origin. Northern smiled. To Sale, that smile was hollow and distant, sad even though he couldn't quite make sense of it. Sale sighed. Lord Northern, do you perhaps bear too much? Northern sighed as well. I guess I'm just going to have to get used to this Lord thing. He peered at Sale and took his eyes away a moment later. There is too much to bear. I want to believe everyone has their own weights. As I do, so do you, so does the king of Ryugan. Sale looked at Northern, admiration peeking at the edges of his eyes. He looked away, smiled, and nodded. You're indeed right, very right. Northern hesitated for a moment, but eventually turned to face him fully. His eyes carried so much seriousness that the atmosphere shifted, and Sale seemed to stiffen. Lord Northern, is there? I was thinking. Northern started, his gaze fixed on the arrow sage. What do you know about the art of war? Sale froze in place. He was most certainly taken aback by the question, so much so that he stuttered the first 2 seconds. The art of war? He asked, looking at Northern. Not that he was expecting a reply. There are certain things I could say I've come to master about that. All from experience. Nonetheless. He paused, letting his words drift through the cold air. I've been a foot soldier. I've been led to battle, and I've led people to battle. I've also worked as a mercenary for hire during certain national conflicts. I'm not entirely estranged from it, but I would still consider myself lacking in experience compared to inbred veterans. Northern nodded after the man's words, assessing them. Sale had more depth than he'd initially given him credit for. That was useful. Sale carefully looked at him. Why do you ask? Is there? He hesitated. Do you need a war general? I have a few I respect. Northern shook his head. Not so urgently. He entered another moment of silence. Each silence was spent processing the knowledge he was receiving from his original self, still stuck in the library. Threads of information wove together in the back of his mind. Histories, patterns, names. The picture was becoming clearer, and he didn't like what he was seeing. But I have a few people I can already depend on. I just don't know the scope of our enemies. I'm trying not to limit my thoughts. He met Sale's eyes. Perhaps to war against such a mighty nation as Riemgard, we will need all the help we can get. Sale trembled. His eyes widened. Northern had simply broken that news like he was talking about how unfortunate it would be to bake a cookie without getting it burnt. It was so unfair of him. Sale was suddenly feeling feverish, looking like he was losing a lot of body water. I'm so sorry. Riemgard? The Empire. He stuttered. Literally. Northern gripped his shoulders with a smile. Geez, why do you look so shaken? It's just the Empire, really. They should be the ones trembling and stuttering so much. Sale's face was still struggling to accept what he was hearing. He was torn between shock and disbelief. But why? Why would we want to probe that area at all? Northern replied, smiling. I love this part. Because they probed us first. Sale looked at him, still miles behind the realm of understanding. But Northern gently patted his shoulders and patiently explained nonetheless. You see, I've been studying for a while and I've been discovering some really shady things that the Empire has done. Their rule of intimidation and avoidance of conflict. Apparently, beneath the noses of all 25 nations of the continent, the Empire has been spreading. Sale frowned. Northern looked at him and warned. By the way, I'm not a man of politics, so my delivery may not be the best. He sighed. The Empire was the one, apparently sponsoring Dante Gaffaire's revolutionary dream. In fact, they were the ones that sponsored the first revolutionary war that brought about the creation of the government. It's safe to say that the Empire owned the government, and some nations had suspicions, which was the main reason why the government's wings were limited so much. All this news shocked Sale over and over again. Each revelation seemed to hit him like a physical blow, his expressions cycling through disbelief, dawning horror, and something approaching outrage. Northern's lips curled. There was a crooked, suspicious smile on his face. But all of this, imagine, was just one of the many ways that the Empire was constantly trying to take over the continent. There was Luengard too, and others. Now, what concerns me more is the greed of the Emperor that's being passed down to generations after him. He paused thoughtfully. The wind picked up for a moment, carrying with it the chill of higher altitudes. Is it really a dream of greed? Or something else? There's something they understand that's making them move in this manner. There has to be something. Empires don't persist across generations on greed alone. Greed burns itself out. This is something else. Something with roots. Northern looked at Sale seriously. I think the Emperor of Riemgard is trying to become an origin.